Beneath the smoke and thunder of the American Civil War lies a shadowed history, one not written in the textbooks but whispered in forgotten letters, hidden in battle-scarred relics, and buried deep in unmarked graves. These are the mysteries that defy the tidy endings of history, where fact and folklore intertwine, and where every answer seems to open a darker question. Imagine a Confederate outpost abandoned overnight, supplies left untouched, soldiers vanished without a trace. Picture coded messages found decades later, their meaning still unsolved, hinting at secret missions that never made it into the official records. Think of the chilling battlefield sightings reported by survivors, figures moving through the fog long after the cannons fell silent. Some stories were silenced intentionally. Others simply dissolved into the haze of time. Yet all of them pull us toward a truth that may never be fully known. So sit back, steady your nerves, and prepare to step into the hidden corridors of the past as we uncover the American Civil War mysteries that will give you chills. It is a quiet spring morning in Georgia. The mist clings low to the ground, curling like pale smoke around the rusted rails of an abandoned railway. The forest presses close here, oak and pine interlaced like the fingers of some ancient hand, concealing the path from curious eyes. If you listen carefully, you might hear the wind whistle through the broken ties. Or perhaps, if the stories are to be believed, the faint echo of iron wheels rolling toward an unknown fate. This is where some believe the final chapter of the Confederate Treasury unfolded. In April of 1865, as Richmond fell to Union forces and the Confederacy crumbled, its leaders faced a desperate problem. The South's gold and silver reserves, millions in today's currency, were at risk of capture. Packed into wagons, guarded by armed soldiers, the treasure set out on a journey south. The precise amount is debated. Some accounts speak of $500,000 in gold, others suggest far more. Along with coins and bullion, there were reportedly barrels of silver, jewelry donated by Southern families, and even church plate melted down for the cause. The initial movements of the Treasury are well documented. It passed through Danville, Virginia, then Greensboro, North Carolina. But by early May, the trail began to blur. Union troops were closing in, Confederate command was in disarray, and the once orderly transport of wealth turned into a series of hurried, fragmented escapes. By the time the treasure reached Georgia, it was aboard what history remembers as the Confederate Treasury train. But then, it was gone. Some witnesses claimed the train was quietly unloaded at a small depot, its cargo spirited away under the cover of darkness. Others insisted it vanished entirely, slipping past the notice of both Union pursuers and local townsfolk. In the decades since, countless expeditions have scoured the rail lines, the forests, and the riverbanks in search of it. All have come back empty-handed. Mainstream historians offer a handful of reasonable explanations. One suggests that much of the treasure was simply spent, used to pay Confederate troops their final wages, purchase supplies for fleeing government officials, or bribe safe passage through hostile territory. Another argues that the gold was seized piecemeal by looters, locals, deserters, and even some of the very men assigned to guard it. In the chaos of a dying nation, greed was as common as hunger. Yet there are stranger accounts. A 19th century memoir from a Confederate officer hints that part of the gold was deliberately hidden by order of high-ranking leaders to fund a possible Southern resurgence years later. According to this version, the treasure was buried somewhere along the Oconee River, marked by signs known only to a select few. No such cache has ever been found. In the 1930s, a farmer claimed he unearthed several gold coins while plowing a field near Washington, Georgia, coins that matched the minting and wear of Confederate-era currency. He refused to say exactly where. Soon after, the coins disappeared into private hands. Some researchers believe the treasure may have been transferred to wagons and taken west, perhaps even as far as Texas, in hopes of placing it beyond Union reach. This theory intertwines with rumors of Confederate agents fleeing overseas, smuggling gold aboard merchant ships bound for safe harbors in Europe or South America. Then there are the more speculative stories, tales of spectral trains seen gliding silently through the Georgia woods on moonless nights, or of strange rhythmic pounding deep underground that miners once swore was the sound of gold being moved in the dark. These accounts, dismissed by most as folklore, nonetheless persist in local storytelling, passed down like half-forgotten warnings. It is tempting to dismiss the entire mystery as nothing more than poor record-keeping and the inevitable confusion of war. Yet the problem remains. There is no definitive record of what became of the bulk of the Confederate treasury. Union forces accounted for only a fraction of the gold they expected to capture. No large deposit was ever discovered in southern banks in the years immediately following the war. Could it be that the treasure lies still, undisturbed beneath layers of soil and secrecy? Modern treasure hunters have brought ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, and drones to the search. They have mapped the old rail lines, cross-referenced eyewitness accounts, and chased down obscure newspaper reports from the 1860s. Some have focused on the swamps and backwaters along the Chattahoochee River, believing the gold was hidden in places too dangerous for Union soldiers to search. Others have followed an entirely different trail, one that leads to small, unexplained deposits of southern gold turning up in northern towns years after the war ended. Theories multiply like shadows. Was the treasure truly lost, or was it quietly absorbed into the fortunes of post-war industrialists? Was it hidden so well that it now lies beneath a highway, a housing development, or the floor of an old barn? Or is it possible that somewhere in the tangle of Georgia's forests, a rotting chest still waits, its contents untouched since the night they were hidden? Each possibility carries its own weight of intrigue. The vanished Confederate Treasury train is not just a question of gold. It is a question of how much of history remains just out of sight, concealed not only by time but by deliberate human choice. Perhaps, on some future day, a hiker will stumble upon an oddly shaped mound, or a storm will wash away a bank to reveal the dull gleam of metal. Until then, the story remains suspended between fact and legend, its final chapter unwritten, its truth just beyond our reach. And as the evening mist settles once again over the abandoned tracks, one cannot help but wonder, was the gold ever here at all? Or has it been gone in ways we do not yet understand, for far longer than we dare imagine? The night air at Chancellorsville was thick with smoke, its scent a bitter mix of black powder and damp earth. Lanterns flickered faintly through the tangle of trees, casting restless shadows across the Virginia wilderness. Somewhere in that darkness, the steady crack of rifle fire broke the fragile silence. And then, a volley rang out, not from the enemy, but from within. It was here, on May 2, 1863, that Confederate General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, one of the South's most brilliant and enigmatic commanders, was struck down. His death, officially attributed to friendly fire followed by pneumonia, has remained a subject of lingering questions for more than a century and a half. The facts, at least at first, seem clear. Jackson was returning from a reconnaissance mission on the night of his greatest tactical triumph. His corps had just executed a daring flank attack that shattered the Union right. Riding back through the darkness with several aides, Jackson approached Confederate lines. Nervous sentries, mistaking them for enemy cavalry, opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times, twice in his left arm and once in his right hand. He was taken to a nearby field hospital. The left arm was amputated, and the general seemed to be recovering. But within days, his condition worsened. Pneumonia set in, and on May 10th, Jackson died. His last recorded words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees," And yet, for all the documentation, something about the story has never sat entirely right. For one, the precise sequence of events that night remains murky. Eyewitness accounts differ on Jackson's position relative to the line of fire, the distance of the shooters, even the number of volleys. Was it truly a tragic accident, born of darkness and confusion? Or could there have been other motives in play? Some historians point to the atmosphere within the Confederate High Command at the time. While revered by his men, Jackson was known for his uncompromising nature and at times strained relationships with fellow generals. Could someone within his own ranks have seen him as a threat, too independent, too unpredictable? Such suggestions are speculative, but the fact that friendly fire incidents were often quietly buried in official reports raises questions about how much was omitted or softened in the record. Then there is the matter of Jackson's medical care. His initial recovery seemed promising. Letters from those attending him speak of good spirits, of plans to return to duty within weeks. The pneumonia diagnosis, while plausible, especially in an era before antibiotics, was based on limited medical understanding. Some modern researchers have wondered if sepsis or even a pulmonary embolism was the real cause. Others have floated darker ideas. Was he deliberately given inadequate care? Could his decline have been hastened, whether through neglect or intention? The chain of custody over Jackson's personal effects also adds a faint whiff of intrigue. His uniform, sword, and personal correspondence were not all returned directly to his family. Some items surfaced years later in private collections, with no clear record of how they left official hands. While this is hardly proof of conspiracy, it speaks to the chaotic, loosely documented nature of the war, conditions in which inconvenient truths could vanish without trace. Outside the realm of verifiable history, local folklore keeps the embers of mystery alive. Stories have been told, always in hushed tones, of Confederate soldiers claiming, long after the war, that Jackson had been mistaken for a Union officer because of the way he rode or the direction from which he approached. In other versions, the shooters knew exactly who he was, but acted on whispered orders. No credible evidence supports these claims, yet their persistence suggests an undercurrent of suspicion that time has never fully erased. More speculative still are the theories linking Jackson's death to larger Confederate fortunes. His loss was a severe blow to the South, one from which many argue its military never fully recovered. Could his removal have been seen, in some twisted calculus, as necessary for other leaders to assert control? It is a dangerous path of reasoning, one that veers into the shadowy territory where history and conjecture blur. The site itself does little to dispel the sense of unease. Today, the roadside marker at Chancellorsville stands quietly among the trees, visited by tourists and history enthusiasts. The landscape has softened with time, but when the light fades and the forest closes in, it is easy to imagine the confusion of that night. The sudden shouts, the muzzle flashes, the thud of a rider falling from the saddle. What really happened in those final days of Stonewall Jackson's life? Was it simply a cruel twist of fate, a perfect storm of darkness, nerves, and battlefield chaos? Or is there more? Something deliberately obscured, hidden beneath layers of official narrative and personal loyalty. The truth, if it exists in full, may be buried forever beneath the weight of time. But one cannot stand here, in the hush of the Virginia woods, without feeling the question pressing close. In the heart of one of the Civil War's most decisive victories, did the South lose its greatest general to chance, or to something far more deliberate? High in the rugged hills of northwestern Pennsylvania, the forests seem to close in on you, dense canopies of oak and hemlock shutting out the sun, their roots gripping ancient soil as streams cut narrow, winding channels through the rock. In winter, the air here turns sharp, the ground crusted with frost. In summer, a heavy stillness settles, broken only by the rush of water and the distant call of birds. It is a place where secrets can sleep undisturbed for generations. It is also where, according to one of the most enduring legends of the American Civil War, a Union Army shipment of gold bullion vanished without a trace. The story begins in the summer of 1863, just weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg. With the Union pushing deeper into Confederate territory, officials feared that a significant shipment of gold, reportedly intended to help finance the war effort, would be vulnerable to attack if sent along normal routes. Instead, it was decided that the gold would be transported quietly, under armed escort, across the more remote northern Pennsylvania wilderness. Details vary between accounts, but most versions agree on the essentials. Several wagons, heavily laden with gold bars and coins, left Harrisburg under the guard of Union soldiers. Their destination, according to some reports, was the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia. Others claim the shipment was bound further north to banks in New York, or to pay Union troops stationed in the Western Territories. The convoy never arrived. Official records from the period are sparse and inconsistent. Some military reports acknowledge the shipment but make no mention of its fate. Others omit it entirely, as if it never existed. What is certain is that rumors of its disappearance began circulating almost immediately, and over the decades, those rumors hardened into one of the most tantalizing mysteries of the war. One mainstream explanation is deceptively simple. The convoy may have been lost to the elements. The terrain was harsh, the roads little more than muddy tracks, and summer storms could turn creeks into raging torrents. A breakdown, a miscalculation in navigation, or an accident in one of the many steep ravines could have doomed the shipment without leaving much trace. In such an isolated region, recovery would have been almost impossible. Yet this theory leaves uncomfortable questions. Even in the 1860s, losing an entire gold shipment without a thorough investigation seems improbable. Why were there no detailed recovery efforts recorded? Why do the available military logs taper off so abruptly, as if someone had deliberately closed the matter? Other historians argue the gold never truly vanished at all, that it was stolen either by Confederate agents or by those charged with guarding it. Northern Pennsylvania was not immune to Southern sympathizers, and the prospect of intercepting such a prize would have been irresistible to enemy spies. A sudden ambush in a narrow pass could have overwhelmed the escort before they had a chance to react. But the possibility of betrayal from within is equally difficult to ignore. In an era when soldiers often went months without pay, the temptation of so much gold, measured in millions by today's standards, might have been too great for some to resist. A few men, in the right moment, could have diverted the shipment, hidden it deep in the wilderness, and vanished into anonymity. Then there are the more speculative accounts. Local folklore tells of settlers who, years later, claimed to have found traces of the convoy, rusted rifle parts, fragments of wagon wheels, even weathered Union buttons buried in the soil. In some versions, these discoveries were accompanied by whispers of seeing strange men digging at night, only to vanish into the forest. None of these finds have been conclusively tied to the gold shipment, yet they persist in regional storytelling. Perhaps the most persistent legend involves a small clearing deep in the Elk County forest. Hunters in the early 20th century spoke of stumbling upon a depression in the ground, as though the earth had been disturbed long ago. The site was marked, they claimed, by a large, moss-covered stone that bore faint carvings, symbols no one could readily identify. Some believe this was a burial site for the gold, hidden by the soldiers themselves, either to prevent it from falling into enemy hands or to recover it later. Modern treasure hunters have taken the search seriously. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies beneath the forest floor, metallic signatures large enough to suggest buried caches. These findings prompted legal disputes between search teams and government agencies, with questions arising over ownership should the gold be found. Even with advanced technology, however, no confirmed recovery has been made. There are, of course, those who take the theories further still. Some suggest the gold was never meant to reach its stated destination at all, but was part of a covert operation, perhaps funding clandestine activities or political maneuvering that official records could never acknowledge. In this telling, the loss of the gold was not an accident, but an intentional erasure. And then there are the truly fringe notions, stories of spectral lights seen in the woods, of phantom wagon trains heard creaking along long-abandoned trails, of an invisible curse that strikes down those who come too close to the truth. Such tales, while belonging more to folklore than to fact, reveal something about the enduring power of the mystery. Because in the end, the gold is more than just gold. It is a tangible connection to a moment when the fate of the nation hung in the balance, a piece of history that, if found, could rewrite parts of the Civil War narrative. Standing in these woods today, the quiet is almost oppressive. The tall trees sway gently, but the air feels heavy, as though holding its breath. Beneath your feet, the ground hides centuries of fallen leaves, roots, and, maybe, something far more valuable. The thought lingers. Could the lost shipment still be here? Just a few feet below the surface, its shine dulled but not forgotten? Or was it spirited away long ago, its trail erased so completely that only the whispers of the forest remember where it went? In a dimly lit display case at a small southern museum, a lone Confederate cipher disc rests under glass, its weathered brass surface etched with concentric rings of letters and numbers. The artifact, designed for encoding and decoding military messages, is silent now, its once secret mechanisms frozen in time. But if you know the history, you understand that one disc, arguably the most important of them all, has never been found. The Confederate cipher disc was not an ornament. During the American Civil War, it was a vital tool for secure communication between distant commands. Two rotating discs, one slightly smaller than the other, were mounted together on a pivot. By aligning letters on the outer ring with those on the inner, military cryptographers could create complex substitution ciphers. A single shift in alignment would change the code entirely, making intercepted messages meaningless to the enemy, unless they had a matching disk and the correct settings. In the war's later years, Confederate forces relied heavily on these devices to send orders about troop movements, supply routes, and strategic plans. One particular disk, held by the Confederate Signal Corps in Richmond, was said to contain unique calibration markings, special notches that allowed for quicker, more secure shifts in code. This disk, according to records, was in active use during some of the most critical operations of 1864 and 1865, and then, as the Confederacy collapsed, it vanished. The last documented mention of the disk appears in early April 1865, just days before the evacuation of Richmond. Confederate forces were burning supply depots, destroying papers, and scattering to avoid capture. Cipher officers were ordered to either carry sensitive materials with them or destroy them. In theory, the missing disk should have been smashed or melted down, but no such destruction was ever recorded, and no fragments were ever recovered. One explanation is that the disk was simply misplaced in the chaos, a small object lost among the vast confusion of retreat. It could have fallen from a saddlebag, been left behind in an abandoned signal station, or been buried under debris as Richmond burned. In such a case, it may still lie somewhere beneath the modern city, an unnoticed relic under layers of brick and asphalt. Another possibility is that Union troops seized it. Northern intelligence was eager to capture any Confederate code devices, and some did make their way into federal hands. But if the disc was taken, why is there no clear record of its acquisition in Union archives? Could it have been kept as a personal war trophy, passed down quietly through generations, its significance unknown to all but a few? More speculative theories suggest the disc never left Confederate hands at all. Some believe it was taken by a fleeing officer who intended to sell it to a foreign power, perhaps agents in Europe sympathetic to the Southern cause. In this scenario, the disc might have crossed the Atlantic and been hidden away in a private collection, far from any battlefield museum. There is even a line of thought that the disc could have been intentionally hidden, not destroyed, in hopes that it might be used again if the Confederacy, or some remnant of it, ever rose once more. If this was the case, it could be buried in a location marked only by coded instructions, waiting for a time that never came. Folklore, as it often does, adds its own embellishments. In some versions of the story, the disc is said to be cursed, its last user allegedly perishing in mysterious circumstances. Others speak of the disc turning up briefly in pawn shops or antique stores before vanishing again, as if it refuses to remain in one place. None of these tales can be substantiated, yet they persist in local storytelling, blurring the line between history and myth. The intrigue surrounding the missing cipher disc is not simply about the object itself, but about what it might still contain. While the physical brass rings are inert, the original calibration settings, if preserved, could potentially unlock surviving Confederate messages that remain unread to this day. Civil War archives hold hundreds of encrypted documents that scholars have never been able to fully decode. Could the missing disc be the key to understanding them? Modern cryptographers doubt that a single disc could provide all the answers. Codes changed frequently, and many were destroyed after use. Yet the symbolic power of finding such a device would be immense, a direct link to the clandestine world of Confederate espionage. Searches have been sporadic over the years. Metal detector enthusiasts have combed old campsites and skirmish grounds, hoping for the distinctive double ring of brass beneath the soil. Private collectors have quietly circulated photographs of similar discs, in hopes of spotting the unique calibration markings described in Confederate records. So far, every lead has dissolved into uncertainty. Standing in the archives today, leafing through brittle Signal Corps logs, you can almost sense the urgency that must have accompanied those final days in Richmond, the fear that the enemy might capture the Confederacy's secrets, the scramble to hide or destroy anything of value. Somewhere in that chaos, the cipher disc slipped away from history's grasp. Was it lost in the flames, hidden deliberately in some long-forgotten cache? Carried far from the battlefields, into a world where its significance faded with time? Or does it still exist, untouched, its brass surface dulled with age but its code alignment frozen in the very position it held on that final day? Somewhere, perhaps in a dusty attic or a buried chest, the missing Confederate cipher disc might still be waiting, its secrets locked tight, its silent rings turning only in the imagination of those who seek it. Beneath the heavy shade of Mississippi's ancient live oaks, the air feels thick, humid, unmoving, and steeped in the scent of earth and river water. Spanish moss hangs in long gray-green curtains, swaying almost imperceptibly in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the Mississippi River winds its slow, relentless path, carving away at the land as it has for centuries. It is here, in this blend of wilderness and history, that some believe the personal papers of Jefferson Davis, the only president of the Confederate States of America, lie hidden in an unmarked grave of soil and secrecy. The official record of Davis's life is voluminous. Letters, speeches, and public documents are preserved in archives and libraries. Yet, curiously, gaps remain. Periods of his presidency and final days of the Confederacy where his correspondence, orders, and private reflections are missing altogether. What happened to these papers, and why were they never recovered? The story begins in April 1865, as the Confederate capital at Richmond collapsed. Davis, fleeing south with members of his cabinet, carried with him not only the remnants of the Confederate Treasury, but also crates and satchels filled with personal and governmental documents. These were more than mere papers. They may have contained military plans, intelligence on Confederate operations abroad, and perhaps even sensitive communications with foreign governments. By the time Davis reached Georgia, the war was all but over. Union cavalry pursued him relentlessly, and the need to protect certain documents grew urgent. Several accounts, drawn from memoirs and later testimonies, suggest that Davis entrusted a small group of loyal aides to conceal or destroy the most sensitive materials before they could be seized. This is where the trail begins to blur. One plausible version of events holds that the papers were simply burned, destroyed to prevent them from becoming evidence in any post-war trial for treason. This would have been the most practical course, and it aligns with Davis's known caution about leaving incriminating material in enemy hands. Yet, no confirmed eyewitness ever claimed to have seen such a fire. Other accounts are more elaborate. According to some, the documents were sealed in metal containers or packed into oilskin bundles and buried in a secret location somewhere along Davis's escape route. The most commonly cited area lies in rural Mississippi, near land once owned by Davis's extended family. There, a network of sympathetic locals could have concealed the cache with the expectation of retrieving it after the political climate cooled. A variation of this theory places the burial site near the Gulf Coast, possibly on a barrier island or in marshland accessible only by boat. In the years following the war, there were sporadic reports of fishermen and hunters finding rusted tin cases or waterlogged trunks, none conclusively linked to Davis, but always accompanied by whispers of the president's hidden papers. What might those papers have contained? The speculation is as intriguing as the mystery itself. Some believe they could reveal evidence of Confederate negotiations with European powers, particularly Britain and France, that went far beyond what is documented in official archives. Others suspect they held unfiltered assessments of Confederate leaders, including criticisms Davis never dared to commit to the public record. A more romantic interpretation imagines personal letters, private correspondence with his wife, Verena, reflections on the war's human cost, or even Davis's own attempt to justify the Confederacy's cause for posterity. Skeptics argue that if such papers ever existed, they would have surfaced by now, either discovered by chance or passed quietly into private collections. Yet history is full of examples where politically sensitive documents remain hidden for generations, either to protect reputations or to preserve a carefully crafted public narrative. The search for Davis's missing papers has been sporadic but persistent. In the late 19th century, amateur historians scoured the grounds of Beauvoir, Davis's retirement home near Biloxi, digging near old outbuildings and tree lines. They found scraps of parchment and corroded fasteners, but nothing definitive. In the 20th century, metal detector hobbyists targeted areas along the routes Davis traveled in 1865, reporting occasional finds of military buttons, belt buckles, and rusted tools, artifacts of the retreat, but not the documents themselves. More recently, archival researchers have combed through Union intelligence reports and confiscated Confederate material, searching for any mention of a recovered cache. The absence of such a record, while not proof of the paper's survival, fuels the belief that they were never captured at all. And yet, there is a persistent undercurrent of rumor. Stories circulate of a sealed trunk, kept in the attic of a Mississippi farmhouse for decades, whose contents were quietly sold to a private collector in the early 1900s. Others speak of a riverbank collapse that may have swallowed the buried cache, consigning it to the shifting mud and silt of the Mississippi forever. If the papers do survive, their historical value would be immense. not only for what they could reveal about Davis himself, but for the light they might shed on the Confederacy's final days. Would they confirm the narratives we already know, or would they challenge them, forcing a reassessment of long-held assumptions about the Civil War's end? Standing in the stillness of the Mississippi woods, it is easy to imagine the scene: a small party of men working by lantern light, shoveling earth over a locked chest, the sounds of distant cavalry faint on the night air. A final tamping of soil, a scattering of leaves, and then nothing. The forest closes in, and the secret becomes part of the land. Was this an act of desperation or of preservation? Did Davis intend for these papers to be found someday, or were they meant to vanish with him into history? The answers remain buried, perhaps literally, somewhere beneath the roots and riverbanks of the South. And until they are uncovered, if they ever are, the secret burial site of Jefferson Davis's personal papers will remain one of the Civil War's most enduring enigmas. In the quiet coastal towns of the Caribbean, where the sea breeze carries the scent of salt and distant rain, there are buildings whose walls seem to hold more than just the warmth of the sun. Shuttered balconies face the harbor, their faded paint peeling under the weight of years. Behind these doors, in rooms lit by oil lamps and shaded from the prying eyes of the street, some believe the last remnants of the Confederate States of America once met in secret, long after the war was declared lost. The idea of a Confederate shadow government in exile is not something one finds in standard Civil War history books. Yet scattered references in memoirs, newspaper clippings, and foreign correspondence suggest that, after 1865, a small network of former Confederate officials, financiers, and military officers continued to coordinate from abroad. Their purpose, according to some accounts, was simple: to preserve the Confederate cause in exile, safeguard remaining funds, and wait for an opportunity to reclaim influence, if not on American soil, then somewhere else entirely. The seeds of this theory lie in the final chaotic weeks of the war. As Richmond fell and Confederate forces surrendered piecemeal across the South, President Jefferson Davis and members of his cabinet fled southward. Some were captured quickly, but others slipped away, aided by sympathizers and foreign connections built during years of diplomacy. Cuba, Bermuda, and even British-controlled Canada appear repeatedly in shipping manifests and travel records of known Confederate operatives. Mainstream historians generally view these post-war travels as isolated attempts at escape or resettlement, defeated men trying to build new lives in safer places. And in many cases, that is undoubtedly true. Yet, there are instances where the same names surface together in unexpected locations, months or even years after the war's official end. Coincidence, perhaps, or could it point to a more coordinated effort? One documented case involves John Slidell, the Confederacy's commissioner to France, who remained in Europe well into the post-war years, maintaining business and political contacts. Reports link him to gatherings in Paris with former Confederate naval officers and Southern financiers. Another involves rumors of meetings in Havana between exiled generals and wealthy plantation owners, who had relocated to the Caribbean rather than face Reconstruction policies in the United States. There is also the matter of Confederate assets that seemingly disappeared in 1865, never accounted for in Union records. Some believe portions of the Confederate Treasury, possibly gold, silver, or valuable bonds, were smuggled out of the country, funneled through neutral ports, and used to support exiled networks. Without these resources, the idea of a functioning government abroad would have been nearly impossible. And yet, physical evidence of such a network is scarce. No minutes of meetings, no formal charters, no coded communiques have surfaced to confirm its existence. Instead, what remains are fragments. A letter here, a bank transfer there, a vague reference in the memoir of a foreign diplomat about Southern gentlemen discussing the future of their republic. Speculation about the shadow government's goals varies widely. The most conservative interpretation sees it as a social and financial network, wealthy Southerners abroad helping one another navigate exile and preserve their fortunes. Others suggest a more active political purpose, lobbying foreign powers for recognition of the Confederacy's legitimacy, or even seeking to establish a Southern-controlled colony in Latin America or the Caribbean. This last idea is not as far-fetched as it might sound. In the mid-19th century, several nations in the region were open to offering land and incentives to foreign settlers, especially those with agricultural expertise. There were even real historical attempts, such as Confederate veterans settling in Brazil, where their descendants still live today. Could the shadow government have envisioned something similar on a larger and more organized scale? More speculative still are the theories that link this exile network to later political or economic movements in the United States. Some writers have suggested that certain Southern banking and shipping interests maintained quiet ties to former Confederate leaders overseas, influencing trade routes and commodity markets long after the war. Without concrete documentation, these claims remain intriguing but unproven. Folklore in some Caribbean port cities adds yet another layer to the mystery. In places like Cienfuegos, Cuba, and Nassau in the Bahamas, local legends speak of American visitors who paid for everything in gold coin, conducted long meetings in shuttered rooms, and departed suddenly, leaving behind only the scent of pipe tobacco and the echo of foreign accents. Some say they were merchants. Others insist they were former officers. A few go further, claiming they were members of a hidden government in exile, still issuing orders in the name of the Confederate States. The truth is difficult to untangle. Records that might clarify the matter are scattered across multiple countries, locked away in national archives, private collections, or lost to time. What can be confirmed is that Confederate expatriates did exist in significant numbers after the war, and that some of them maintained close ties to one another in distant lands. Whether that constitutes a government is still up for debate. Standing in the narrow streets of Havana's Old Quarter or along the sun-bleached docks of Nassau, it is tempting to imagine those meetings. Men in worn but well-cut suits, speaking in low tones about strategies and futures, a folded map spread on the table between them. Outside, the life of the city carries on, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that history may be quietly rewriting itself behind closed doors. Did a Confederate shadow government truly exist, biding its time in exile, waiting for a moment that never came? Or are these scattered clues nothing more than the unconnected remnants of a lost cause, stitched together by the human tendency to seek patterns in the fog of history? Until the missing records surface, if they ever do, the truth will remain hidden, carried on the warm winds of foreign shores, somewhere between history and legend. In a quiet corner of a small Virginia historical society, a single display case holds a delicate leather-bound diary. Its pages are yellowed, the ink faded, the script neat but hurried, as though written under pressure, perhaps by candlelight. The name on the inside cover is one known to any student of Civil War espionage: Belle Boyd. Yet this surviving volume is only a fragment, a lone remnant of a much larger and more personal record of her life. The rest, her wartime journals, are gone. Belle Boyd was no ordinary figure in the American Civil War. Born in Martinsburg, Virginia, now West Virginia, she became one of the Confederacy's most celebrated spies. Barely in her 20s, she used charm, quick thinking, and daring to pass critical information to Confederate generals, including the famed Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Union officers arrested her more than once, yet she repeatedly managed to regain her freedom, slipping back into the dangerous currents of espionage. During the war, Belle is believed to have kept extensive journals, recording not just her intelligence work but also her private thoughts on the conflict, her travels, and the figures she encountered. Some accounts suggest she was meticulous in her documentation, noting dates, locations, and even the nuances of coded messages. If these journals had survived, they could have offered a rare, first-hand view into the hidden mechanics of Civil War spycraft, seen through the eyes of one of its most infamous operatives. So, what became of them? The public record picks up her story after the war. Belle published a memoir in 1865 titled Belle Boyd in Camp and Prison, a lively account that blends fact and self-promotion in equal measure. But this work, though valuable, was not her raw, unfiltered diary. It lacks the granular detail and immediacy one would expect from daily wartime notes. Contemporary sources, including letters from her acquaintances, refer to her war books or spy diaries as still existing after her release from prison. And then, nothing. One possibility is that Belle herself destroyed the journals. After the war, she married a Union naval officer and began touring as a stage actress, recasting her image for a new audience. The contents of her private writings might have conflicted with her post-war life, containing politically sensitive information or unflattering portraits of people she could not afford to offend. Yet if she had truly wanted them gone, why do scattered references to the journals persist well into the late 19th century? Some suggest she may have sold them to a private collector. Civil War memorabilia was highly sought after, and a spy's personal journals would have been an extraordinary prize. In this version of events, the papers may still exist, locked away in a family archive, or lost in the shuffle of estate sales. Another theory points to deliberate confiscation. Belle's activities were closely monitored by Union intelligence, and she was often suspected of having allies in both North and South. Could her journals have been seized as evidence or as potential intelligence material, then quietly filed away or destroyed by the government? Researchers have combed through military archives, but no official record of such a seizure has been found. Local folklore in Martinsburg offers a more dramatic version. According to one story, Belle entrusted her wartime writings to a friend during her final days in Virginia, instructing them to hide the journals until she returned. The friend, fearing retaliation or theft, is said to have buried them on rural property, but the exact location was never recorded, and the supposed custodian died before passing on the secret. More speculative ideas venture into the realm of personal intrigue. Belle was known for her complex relationships, both romantic and political. Her diaries may have contained names, alliances, and betrayals that could have tarnished reputations or reopened old wounds decades after the war. In such a scenario, the disappearance of the journals might have been the result of someone else's intervention, motivated by self-preservation rather than Belle's own wishes. In the absence of the original writings, historians must piece together Belle's life from secondary sources: her published memoir, her surviving correspondence, and the often biased accounts of those who crossed her path. This patchwork leaves gaps that the missing journals might have filled with vivid immediacy. Did she record the exact details of her espionage operations? Did she reveal the full extent of her contacts in Union territory? Did she leave behind personal reflections that might challenge our current understanding of her loyalties, ambitions, or regrets? Standing in the hushed stillness of that small museum, it's difficult not to wonder what might be lost between those missing covers. The surviving diary on display offers only glimpses, a passing mention of a coded message, an oblique reference to a dangerous journey, a half-finished sentence cut off by a blot of ink. The rest is silence, pages that may never again see the light of day. Were Belle Boyd's wartime journals destroyed in a moment of self-protection, spirited away by a private buyer, confiscated by the government, or hidden so well that their location is known only to the Earth itself? The answers remain buried in history's shadows, leaving only the tantalizing possibility that somewhere, in an attic trunk or beneath a forgotten patch of soil, Belle Boyd's true story still waits to be read. In a dim, dust-choked archive in the remnants of a Confederate naval yard, a single sheet of yellowing paper lies preserved behind glass. On it, a crude sketch shows a conical device with jagged fins and a long, narrow shaft, a naval torpedo, as it might have looked in the 1860s. The lines are simple, even rough, yet they hint at a level of engineering far ahead of its time. For years, Confederate innovations in underwater warfare remained a little-known corner of Civil War history. But one mystery refuses to fade: the disappearance of the Confederacy's most advanced torpedo plans. By the middle of the war, Southern engineers had begun to close the technological gap with the Union Navy. Among their most unsettling inventions were torpedoes, a term then used to describe both stationary mines and early forms of self-propelled explosives. While the Hunley submarine would claim its own place in legend, Confederate torpedo development was equally groundbreaking, involving not only floating mines to defend harbors, but experimental devices that could be guided or even launched beneath the surface. The most intriguing of these were said to be the product of a small team working under the Confederate Torpedo Bureau, based in Richmond and later in Mobile. According to wartime correspondence, these engineers had designed a new type of spar torpedo with a unique triggering mechanism, as well as an experimental prototype for a self-propelled device that could travel short distances under its own power. If the claims were true, the Confederacy was within reach of creating one of the first functional underwater offensive weapons decades before such devices became common. But when the Confederacy collapsed in 1865, the detailed engineering drawings, specifications, and prototypes of these advanced torpedoes vanished. Official records suggest that as Union forces closed in, Confederate officers ordered the destruction of sensitive materials. Some blueprints may have been burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. This explanation is practical, plausible, and fits the broader pattern of deliberate sabotage carried out in the war's final days. And yet, the story is complicated by scattered, troubling clues. Union intelligence reports from April 1865 mention the capture of instruments and drawings of underwater engines in several southern cities, but no such items are now cataloged in U.S. Navy archives. In some cases, the inventories simply stop mid-page, as though the subject was no longer pursued, or perhaps diverted elsewhere. There are also post-war memoirs from Union naval officers who claimed to have seen and even tested Confederate torpedo devices after the war, though no surviving examples match their descriptions. Were these weapons quietly absorbed into post-war research, their origins obscured? Other theories push in different directions. One holds that the missing plans were smuggled out of the South before the war's end, perhaps carried by Confederate agents fleeing to sympathetic ports in Europe. Britain, in particular, had shipyards eager to experiment with new naval technologies, and Confederate commerce raiders like the CSS Alabama had already been built there. Could the torpedo designs have been offered in exchange for safe passage or financial support? Another possibility is that the plans were taken not by foreigners but by private hands within the South itself. Engineers or officers might have hidden them with the hope of selling the technology later, or of using it to launch new ventures in peacetime. In such a scenario, the plans might have languished in private collections, their significance forgotten by later generations. Local legends, as they often do, add a final layer of mystery. Along the Gulf Coast, there are stories of fishermen hauling up strange, rusted devices from the seabed in the decades after the war, objects that did not match Union or later naval designs. In one version, a long, corroded cylinder with a sealed brass nose was found embedded in the mud near an old Confederate fort. The object reportedly disappeared into the hands of a private collector before any official examination could be made. The absence of the original blueprints leaves historians with only fragments, vague descriptions in wartime letters, rough sketches in personal notebooks, and tantalizing references in captured documents. Without the full plans, it is impossible to know exactly how advanced these Confederate designs were, or whether they could have altered the course of the naval war had they been deployed in greater numbers. In the cool, echoing silence of a maritime museum, one can stand before the surviving relics of the Confederate Torpedo Bureau, rusted casings, trigger mechanisms, bits of metal salvaged from riverbeds, and feel the weight of what's missing. Somewhere between the end of the war and the reshaping of the South, a piece of military history slipped away, leaving behind only the outline of what might have been. Were the vanished Confederate torpedo plans destroyed in the fires of retreat, quietly spirited into foreign hands, or hidden away in some forgotten trunk, waiting to be rediscovered? Until those blueprints resurface, if they ever do, the true scope of the Confederacy's underwater ambitions will remain an unanswered question, drifting in the depths of history. In the grand hall of the former Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, the air once carried the faint scent of oil paint and polished wood. High ceilings loomed above ornate moldings, and shafts of afternoon light filtered through tall windows, striking the walls where portraits of the Confederacy's leaders looked down with frozen expressions. Among them, according to contemporary accounts, hung a singular painting, an official portrait commissioned during the war, believed by some to hold symbolic meaning far beyond its artistic value. Today, that portrait is gone. The records describe it only in fragments. Some say it depicted Jefferson Davis in formal attire, seated at his desk with the Confederate flag draped behind him. Others insist it was not Davis at all, but an allegorical work, perhaps showing the Confederacy as a classical figure, surrounded by symbols of agriculture and military strength. Whichever version is true, this portrait was no ordinary decoration. It was painted at a time when the Confederate government sought to project legitimacy and permanence, even as the war's outcome grew uncertain. Commissioned sometime between 1862 and 1864, the work was reportedly completed by a Southern artist of considerable reputation. Its unveiling, mentioned briefly in Richmond newspapers, was meant to be a public statement of resilience. The Capitol's central chamber, already adorned with state flags and military banners, gained in this painting a visual manifesto, a reminder to lawmakers and visitors alike that the Confederacy saw itself not as a rebellion, but as a nation destined to endure. Yet, when Union forces entered Richmond in April 1865, the portrait was nowhere to be found. Mainstream explanations suggest it was simply removed in the chaos of evacuation. As Confederate officials fled, they carried away what valuables they could: documents, silver, and other portable symbols of authority. The portrait may have been rolled, crated, and sent south with the retreating government, only to be lost or destroyed in the weeks that followed. Fires set to prevent Union seizure consumed much of Richmond's stored property. Perhaps the painting perished in those flames. But if so, why do scattered references to it appear after the war's end? In 1867, a New Orleans newspaper hinted that a certain Richmond painting of the late government had surfaced in private hands, though it offered no details. Decades later, a Confederate veteran recalled seeing what he believed to be the same portrait hanging in a private parlor in Georgia. This has led to more speculative theories. One suggests the painting was deliberately hidden, perhaps buried or concealed in a barn, as a relic for future generations of Southern loyalists. Another posits that it was taken as a war trophy by a Union officer, either officially as part of captured Confederate property or unofficially as personal loot. In such a case, it could have traveled far from Richmond, passing quietly through family estates and eventually disappearing into an attic or storage room, its origin forgotten. There is also a less conventional interpretation that the portrait's disappearance was intentional not only to protect it from capture, but to erase its political symbolism. Some within the defeated South may have viewed it as a reminder of a painful loss, preferring to let it vanish rather than preserve it as an object of mourning or nostalgia. The absence of any surviving photograph deepens the mystery. While other Confederate-era paintings were documented before their loss, no verified image of this portrait has surfaced. Without visual proof, even its exact subject remains uncertain. Was it truly Davis, an allegorical vision? Or perhaps a group depiction of Confederate leaders, something too politically charged to survive the Reconstruction era intact? In the former Capitol building today, the walls are hung with period artworks and artifacts carefully preserved for public display. But the space where this painting might have once been is now unremarkable, its history unacknowledged by any plaque or caption. To the casual visitor, there is no sign that an important work ever hung there. Only those who have read the obscure accounts or sifted through the half-buried references know that something is missing. The unanswered questions linger. If the portrait still exists, is it rolled away in the dark recess of some forgotten archive, the canvas brittle with age, but the colors still faintly vivid? Could it hang, unnoticed, in a private home, its owner unaware of its wartime provenance? Or was it destroyed long ago, leaving only the ghost of its image in the memories of those who once saw it? The silence of the archives offers no confirmation, no closure. And in that silence, the missing portrait from the Confederate Capitol remains more than just a lost work of art. It is a fragment of a vanished nation's self-image, its fate hidden somewhere in the shadows between history and memory. In the hushed reading room of the National Archives, where the air smells faintly of aged paper and leather bindings, there exists a file marked only by a simple tag, Correspondence, Miscellaneous. Inside, among a scatter of yellowed envelopes and crumbling stationery, archivists once claimed there was a single peculiar letter, written in a hand both graceful and urgent, addressed directly to President Abraham Lincoln. Known among a handful of researchers as the widow's letter, it has not been seen for decades. What made this letter different from the thousands Lincoln received during his presidency? According to those who read it before it vanished, the pages carried a tone both personal and cryptic, blending grief with what some described as a veiled warning. The writer identified herself only as a widow of this war, her name omitted or perhaps deliberately removed in later transcripts. The earliest known reference to the letter appears in an 1870 inventory of Lincoln correspondence compiled by clerks under the direction of the Library of Congress. The brief entry notes, "Letter from widow concerning confidential matter, contents marked for President's eyes only." No further details were recorded. Mainstream historians tend to treat it as one of countless wartime appeals Lincoln received, requests for pensions, pleas for clemency, or expressions of loyalty from bereaved family members. The confidential notation could simply have referred to a private family matter. And yet, the absence of the actual letter from both the Library of Congress and the National Archives raises questions. Those who believe there is more to the story point to fragments preserved in later notes by 19th century Lincoln scholars. These suggest that the widow's message may have contained references to military movements or political intrigue, information unusual for an ordinary civilian to possess. One claim, repeated in private correspondence between researchers, is that the letter hinted at a conspiracy among those close to the seat of power that could endanger the president himself. If true, it might have been dismissed at the time as the ramblings of a grieving mind, or, more ominously, suppressed to avoid stirring panic. The question then becomes, how would a widow, presumably of modest means, have acquired such knowledge? Was she the wife of a high-ranking officer, privy to private discussions? Could she have been connected to the shadow world of Civil War espionage, where civilian informants often blurred the line between patriotism and personal vendetta? A few speculative accounts go further, suggesting the widow's letter might have been linked to events leading up to Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. In these theories, the letter's warning, if it was a warning, came too late or was ignored, its relevance only recognized in hindsight. While there is no direct evidence to connect it to John Wilkes Booth or his co-conspirators, the timing of its disappearance from public records has fueled persistent whispers. More prosaic explanations certainly exist. The letter may have been misfiled, damaged, or discarded during the many reorganizations of government archives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Fires, floods, and simple human error have erased countless historical documents. Yet the fact that it was singled out in early inventories as "for the president's eyes only" keeps curiosity alive. Some archivists quietly believe the letter could still be out there, not in a government vault, but in a private collection. During the chaotic years after Lincoln's death, many of his personal effects were dispersed among family, friends, and even souvenir hunters. A misplaced or pilfered piece of correspondence could easily have found its way into the hands of a collector, its significance magnified or obscured depending on what it contained. Folklore in certain historical circles adds one last twist, a rumor that a partial transcription of the widow's letter was once shown to a biographer in the early 1900s, but the writer, fearing legal or political repercussions, never published it. If such a transcription exists, it remains hidden, perhaps locked away in a desk drawer or safety deposit box, waiting for someone who understands its weight to bring it to light. In the absence of the letter itself, we are left only with the tantalizing outline of a mystery, a grieving woman's voice, speaking across the smoke and chaos of the Civil War. Her words meant only for the president's eyes. Did she write to share sorrow? To plead for justice? To warn him of a danger no one else dared to name? Somewhere, perhaps, the original pages still exist, folded in an envelope, the ink faded, but the meaning intact. And until they resurface, the widow's letter remains suspended in the liminal space between fact and speculation, a fragment of the past that may yet have more to say than we realize. The night over Florida's Gulf Coast can be eerily still. When the wind dies, the water becomes a sheet of dark glass, broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing fish or the slow rise of the tide. In such moments, the horizon seems to vanish, and the sea becomes an infinite expanse. It was in this watery world, in October of 1868, that Colonel St. Leger Grenfell, former Confederate officer, British-born adventurer, and one of the most enigmatic figures of the Civil War, disappeared without a trace. Grenfell's life before his vanishing was as colorful as it was controversial. Born in Liverpool, England, in 1808, he claimed a long and varied military career, fighting in European wars, serving in the French Foreign Legion, and traveling widely across Africa and the Americas. By the time the American Civil War erupted, Grenfell had already earned a reputation as a skilled horseman, a daring soldier, and a man who thrived in dangerous circumstances. In 1862, he joined the Confederate cause, eventually becoming an aide-de-camp to General John C. Pemberton. But his most infamous chapter came when he was implicated in the so-called Northwest Conspiracy, an alleged Confederate plot to liberate Southern prisoners held in Northern camps, incite uprisings in Union territory, and disrupt the 1864 presidential election. Captured in Chicago, Grenfell was tried alongside several co-conspirators. He was sentenced to death, but President Andrew Johnson commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. He was sent to Fort Jefferson, a remote military prison in the Dry Tortugas, off the coast of Florida, a desolate outpost surrounded by miles of open ocean. Life at Fort Jefferson was harsh. The heat was oppressive, fresh water was scarce, and disease was rampant. Grenfell, then in his 60s, spent nearly 4 years there. Yet even in this isolated fortress, he seemed to be planning his next escape. On the night of March 7, 1868, Grenfell and 3 other prisoners stole a small boat and rowed away under the cover of darkness. What happened next remains uncertain. The official report stated that a sudden storm swept across the Gulf of Mexico that night, and the boat, overloaded and ill-prepared, likely capsized. Search efforts found no trace of the men, leading authorities to conclude they had drowned. Given the treacherous waters and the limited supplies they carried, this was a reasonable assumption. But almost immediately, rumors began to circulate. Some accounts from the time claimed that a fishing vessel spotted a small craft matching the escape boat's description days later, far from Fort Jefferson. Others spoke of Grenfell making his way to Cuba, aided by Confederate sympathizers who had settled there after the war. The British consulate in Havana, according to one unverified report, received a mysterious visitor in mid-1868 who matched Grenfell's description but gave no name. There were also stories from the Gulf Coast of Florida, whispers of an older Englishman living quietly under an assumed identity, fluent in Spanish and well-versed in maritime trade. While none of these sightings were ever confirmed, they fed the belief that Grenfell had survived and simply vanished into the wider world. Some historians have argued that his escape, if successful, would have been consistent with his character. Grenfell had evaded danger and capture in multiple countries before. Disappearing into obscurity was well within his capabilities. Others caution that the romantic image of the aging adventurer slipping away to freedom may be nothing more than wishful thinking, a legend crafted to soften the grim reality of his likely drowning. Adding to the intrigue, Grenfell's personal effects, including letters, maps, and journals, were never fully accounted for after his disappearance. Did he take them with him as part of a planned escape, or were they lost in the chaos of the storm? If they survived, they might offer clues about whether the escape was spontaneous or part of a larger, coordinated effort. In the decades since, the mystery of Grenfell's fate has drawn occasional attention from historians, treasure hunters, and storytellers. Some have searched the small islands and mangrove channels along Florida's coast for traces of the escape, while others have combed Cuban archives for any record of a foreigner matching his description. None have produced definitive proof. Standing on the ramparts of Fort Jefferson today, it is easy to imagine the scene. The distant splash of oars, the small silhouette of a boat disappearing into the black expanse of the Gulf, the tightening wind hinting at the storm to come. Did Grenfell meet his end that night, swallowed by the sea he tried to conquer? Or did he ride the waves to a new life, vanishing into the anonymity he may have sought all along? Until some fragment of evidence surfaces, a recovered logbook, a letter from Exile, a burial record in a foreign port, the fate of Colonel St. Leger Grenfell will remain one of the Civil War's most enduring mysteries, suspended between the cold finality of the ocean and the warm, persistent glow of legend. In the dim archives of a maritime museum in Liverpool, the faint scent of salt water still seems to cling to certain relics, bits of rigging, brass instruments, and fragments of polished wood, once part of proud vessels now long gone. Among these is a bound volume, thick with pages mottled by time and damp, a surviving log from the Confederate commerce raider CSS Shenandoah. Yet, curators and historians alike have long whispered that this is not the only log the ship ever carried, and that somewhere another more revealing record still lies hidden. The Shenandoah was no ordinary warship. Originally built as a merchant vessel in Britain, she was secretly refitted for the Confederacy in 1864. Under the command of Captain James Waddell, she embarked on a globe-spanning mission to disrupt Union commerce, targeting the U.S. whaling fleet in the remote waters of the Pacific and Arctic. By the time she completed her voyage, the Shenandoah had circumnavigated the globe, captured or destroyed more than 36 ships, and remained active months after the Confederacy's official surrender, making her the last Confederate vessel to lower its flag. The official logbook, preserved in maritime collections, records much of this journey, positions plotted with care, weather notes, shipboard routines, and the terse entries typical of naval records. But references in letters, memoirs, and even British port documents hint at the existence of a second log, kept privately, perhaps by Waddell himself or another senior officer. This hidden log is said to have contained more detailed accounts of the ship's movements, especially during the murky final months of her cruise, when the Shenandoah sailed unaware, or perhaps not entirely unaware, that the war had ended. Why would such a log exist, and why would it be kept separate from the official record? One plausible explanation is that it contained politically sensitive information. The Shenandoah's operations took her into neutral ports, territories where Confederate presence was technically illegal under international law. A private log might have recorded the true nature of these visits, meetings with foreign agents or clandestine arrangements for resupply and intelligence. Another possibility involves the delicate matter of the ship's surrender. When Waddell finally learned of the Confederacy's collapse, he sailed the Shenandoah to Liverpool and surrendered her to British authorities rather than the U.S. Navy, a move that spared his crew from prosecution but raised eyebrows in Washington. A hidden log might reveal the deliberations behind that decision, or even suggest that Confederate leadership in exile was still in contact with the ship's officers in those final weeks. Speculation has also touched on the ship's Arctic operations. In the summer of 1865, the Shenandoah captured numerous American whaling ships in the Bering Sea, some after the Confederacy had already ceased to exist. The official log records these actions plainly, but a more candid account might have addressed the moral and legal implications, or revealed whether Waddell truly believed the war was still ongoing. What became of this alleged second log is the heart of the mystery. One theory holds that it was destroyed upon arrival in Liverpool, deliberately erased to avoid incriminating the crew or implicating British collaborators. Another suggests it was removed from the ship before surrender and hidden among private papers, perhaps taken by Waddell himself, who lived in England for several years before returning to the United States. Yet there are tantalizing hints that the hidden log may have survived. In the early 20th century, a British bookseller claimed to have handled a private journal of a Confederate cruiser, though he did not name the vessel. In the 1960s, an American collector reported hearing of a Shenandoah logbook not in any museum, kept in a family collection since the Victorian era. Neither lead has ever been confirmed. If the log does exist, what could it reveal? Could it confirm long-suspected visits to certain ports that were officially denied? Might it name foreign individuals who provided aid in violation of neutrality laws? Could it shed light on whether the Shenandoah's crew had any role in the broader network of Confederate agents operating in Europe and the Pacific during and after the war? The absence of clear answers has made the hidden log as much a subject of maritime folklore as of academic inquiry. For some, it represents a missing piece of the Shenandoah's already remarkable story, a key that could unlock the truth about her final months at sea. For others, it is simply a legend born from the gaps and silences that always accompany wartime records. Standing before the preserved official log, its ink faded but still legible, one cannot help but imagine the possibility of another book, one that was never meant for public eyes. Was it quietly destroyed in a Liverpool drawing room, its pages burned to ash before anyone could read them? Or does it still exist somewhere, tucked away in an old sea chest, its binding stiff with salt, its words waiting to tell a version of the Shenandoah's journey that history has yet to hear? In the stillness of the southern pine forests, the earth sometimes yields strange things, rusted iron hoops, fragments of weathered barrels, and the faint, acrid scent of black powder that has somehow lingered for more than a century. In swampy lowlands and remote riverbanks, there are places where locals claim the ground conceals far more than roots and stone. Places where, they say, caches of Confederate gunpowder remain buried, hidden since the final days of the Civil War. The Confederacy's war effort relied on an extensive network of powder mills, storage depots, and transport routes. By 1865, as Union forces advanced deeper into Southern territory, the supply chain was breaking apart. Official orders called for the destruction of strategic stores to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Some stockpiles were burned, others dumped into rivers, their contents lost in great explosions or clouds of choking smoke. Yet, scattered accounts from the war's end hint at a different fate for certain reserves. In letters and post-war memoirs, Confederate officers and civilians spoke of barrels of powder being quietly removed from depots and hidden in secluded locations, deep woods, caves, or marshy ground known only to a handful of men. The reasons for these actions remain unclear. Were these caches meant as a safeguard for continued resistance? Were they stored with the hope of one day reviving the Confederate cause? Or were they simply hidden in desperation, their locations forgotten as the chaos of defeat scattered those who knew the truth? One well-documented example comes from Georgia's Oconee River region, where in 1865, residents reported seeing wagons loaded with sealed powder barrels vanish into the pine thickets, escorted by armed cavalry. The soldiers never returned, and no official record of that shipment's destruction has been found. Decades later, farmers plowing near the river claimed to have struck buried barrels, though whether they were full of powder or emptied long before is unknown. Another story comes from the mountains of western North Carolina, where a Union patrol in the summer of 1865 found a crude wooden sign nailed to a tree, warning, "Danger, powder buried ahead." The soldiers searched but found nothing, and the origin of the sign remains a mystery. Mainstream historians acknowledge that small amounts of hidden powder could have survived, but point out the difficulty of preserving such a volatile material over long periods. Black powder exposed to moisture loses its effectiveness, and wooden barrels buried in damp soil would quickly rot. From this perspective, most supposed caches would have degraded beyond use within a few years. Still, occasional discoveries challenge that assumption. In the 20th century, several rural construction projects in the South uncovered intact powder barrels, their contents still dangerously potent. In one case in Louisiana, workers widening a drainage ditch unearthed 3 sealed barrels, later identified as Civil War-era manufacture, buried beneath more than 5 feet of packed clay. Speculative theories suggest that not all caches were meant for immediate wartime use. Some believe certain reserves were part of long-term contingency plans, perhaps tied to the idea of a Confederate insurgency that never materialized. Others imagine a more practical motive, powder hidden away for hunting, mining, or personal defense in the uncertain years of Reconstruction, when official authority was weak and violence was common. Folklore has woven its own threads into the story. In some southern communities, tales persist of ghostly lights seen drifting near suspected cache sites, or of unexplained sounds, like muffled thumps, emanating from beneath the earth after heavy rains. While these accounts belong more to legend than to documented history, they have kept interest in the hidden gunpowder alive, inspiring amateur treasure hunters to probe riverbanks and backwoods with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. From a historian's standpoint, the question is not whether caches were hidden, they almost certainly were, but whether any remain undiscovered. Civil War-era maps often show storage sites in surprisingly remote areas, and the Confederacy's need for secrecy means that many such locations were never recorded in official documents. A buried storehouse of powder could lie beneath a modern road, a pasture, or a dense thicket, its presence unknown except to the land itself. Standing on the edge of a cypress swamp in Mississippi, where local tradition insists a shipment of Confederate powder was sunk in shallow water and covered with reeds, the air is heavy with the scent of damp vegetation. The water moves sluggishly, reflecting the tangled canopy above. Somewhere beneath that murky surface, perhaps, lies the rotted wood of a powder barrel, or nothing at all, just the echo of a story passed from one generation to the next. Were these caches simply lost in the confusion of the Confederacy's collapse, their locations fading from memory? Were they deliberately hidden with a purpose, one that outlived the war but never came to fruition? Or are they merely legends, born from the South's long habit of wrapping its history in shadow and secrecy? Until the Earth gives up more of its secrets, the truth of the hidden Confederate gunpowder caches will remain locked in the ground, dangerous, elusive, and silent. In a quiet, archival room deep within the climate-controlled vaults of a Southern historical society, a single leather satchel sits behind glass. Its stitching is frayed, its brass buckles dulled by age, and faint traces of mud still cling to its edges. Once, it is said, this bag carried the personal correspondence and military dispatches of Confederate General John Bell Hood, orders, reports, and strategic notes penned during the desperate final months of the war. But the papers themselves, the heart of the satchel's contents, are gone. Hood was a complex and controversial figure. Known for his aggressive tactics and personal bravery, he rose to command the Army of Tennessee during some of the Confederacy's darkest days. By late 1864, after the costly battles around Atlanta and his ambitious but disastrous Tennessee campaign, Hood's army was shattered. Yet in the midst of retreat, he continued to send and receive dispatches, communications that could have shed light on his decisions, his state of mind, and the intricate movements of both Confederate and Union forces. According to post-war accounts, Hood kept many of these papers with him as he withdrew southward after the crushing defeat at Nashville. Couriers, aides-de-camp, and field officers handled them, often under chaotic conditions. Some messages were penned hastily on scraps of paper, others on formal Confederate letterhead, sealed with wax. The satchel, by all reports, was rarely out of his possession. Yet somewhere between the retreat from Tennessee in December 1864 and Hood's resignation in January 1865, the trail of these documents vanishes. The simplest explanation is that the dispatches were destroyed, burned to keep them from falling into Union hands. It was common practice in both armies to destroy sensitive material when defeat was imminent. But if that was the case, no one ever recorded the act. In fact, several of Hood's surviving letters from the period make vague references to records in hand and papers to be reviewed long after they should have been destroyed. Another possibility is that they were lost in transit. During the retreat, supply wagons were abandoned, bridges burned, and rivers forded in haste. It is not hard to imagine a courier's horse shot from under him, the satchel tumbling into the mud or swept away in a flooded stream. But such a loss would likely have been noted in official correspondence, especially if it involved strategic documents. The more speculative theories are where the mystery deepens. Some historians have suggested that the missing dispatches may have contained material Hood did not want preserved for posterity, evidence of disagreements with his subordinates, criticisms of Confederate high command, or acknowledgments of mistakes in judgment. Could they have been deliberately hidden or destroyed by Hood himself after the war, when he was attempting to defend his reputation in his memoirs? Others propose that the dispatches were taken as war trophies. Union officers often collected Confederate documents, and such a find would have been a prize worth keeping. If that happened, the papers could have been spirited north and passed down quietly through a family's possessions, their significance unrecognized outside of historical circles. There is even a persistent rumor, unverified but intriguing, that some of Hood's missing papers surfaced briefly in the late 19th century. A small-town newspaper in Mississippi claimed that a collection of Confederate dispatches had been found in the attic of a former soldier's home, including orders signed by Hood himself. The papers were said to have been purchased by an anonymous collector and never seen again. Why do these documents matter so much? Hood's Tennessee campaign remains one of the most debated episodes of the Civil War. Critics have long argued that his decisions, particularly his choice to launch frontal assaults at Franklin, led to unnecessary losses and hastened the collapse of his army. Supporters contend that Hood was acting under impossible circumstances, and that his orders were misunderstood or misrepresented after the fact. The missing dispatches could provide critical evidence one way or the other, offering an unfiltered view of his intentions and his understanding of the battlefield. Today, the empty satchel in the display case is both artifact and symbol, a tangible reminder of something once present and now irretrievably absent. Visitors lean in close, as if by studying the worn leather they might somehow glimpse the inked words it once protected. But the silence of the glass and the soft hum of the archive offer no answers. Were the dispatches consumed in a hurried fire as Union troops closed in? Were they dropped in the chaos of retreat, buried in the mud of some unmarked road? Or are they still out there, tucked away in a forgotten trunk, waiting for a curious hand to open the lid and bring them back into the light? At dawn, the fields of Shiloh are cloaked in a mist so thick it clings to the trees like breath on glass. The grass, damp from the Tennessee night, bends underfoot, and the stillness is broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Yet, on certain mornings, if the stories are to be believed, another sound drifts across the quiet landscape. The steady, rhythmic beat of a drum, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere beyond the veil of fog. The Battle of Shiloh, fought in April 1862, was one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. For 2 days, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a struggle that left more than 23,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Amid the chaos, drums played a vital role, not for ceremonial pomp, but as instruments of war. Drummers relayed orders, signaled maneuvers, and kept the cadence for advancing troops. Many were young boys, some barely in their teens, who marched into danger armed only with a pair of sticks and a taut drumhead. One such drummer, whose name has been lost to history, is at the center of the legend. Accounts from veterans and locals alike speak of a Confederate drummer who is said to have played relentlessly through the morning assault on Union lines, his cadence urging men forward even as musket fire and artillery thundered around him. Some say he was struck down before noon, his drum falling silent in the mud. Others insist they saw him still beating the call to charge long after his regiment was scattered, as though refusing to yield to the tide of battle. In the years after the war, strange reports began to surface from those who visited the battlefield. Soldiers returning to pay respects, farmers working the land, and even tourists claimed to hear drumming in the distance, sometimes slow and mournful, other times quick and urgent, as if calling troops to advance. No drummer was ever found, and the sound would fade as suddenly as it began. The simplest explanation is that these were the natural noises of the countryside misinterpreted by expectant ears. The wind through the trees, the crack of branches, or the distant roll of thunder could easily be mistaken for a drumbeat, especially in a place so steeped in memory and loss. Yet those who insist they have heard it describe the rhythm as deliberate, human, and eerily consistent, often matching the military beats used during the Civil War. Some historians suggest that the legend may have been born from the battlefield's emotional weight. Shiloh was a place where young lives ended violently, and the figure of a boy drummer became a symbol of both innocence and sacrifice. In this view, the phantom drummer is not a ghost in the literal sense, but a cultural echo, a story carried forward to embody the spirit of those who fought and died there. Others entertain more speculative possibilities. Could the reports be connected to actual physical remnants of the war? The battlefield soil has yielded countless artifacts over the years: mini balls, buttons, belt buckles, and fragments of drums. Perhaps the repeated tales of drumming are tied to some yet undiscovered relic, a buried instrument whose presence stirs the imagination of those who walk nearby. And then there are the stranger accounts, the ones that keep the legend alive. Park rangers have quietly shared stories of visitors asking about the reenactor they saw in gray uniform, playing a drum in the morning mist, only for the staff to explain that no reenactments were scheduled that day. On more than one occasion, small groups have reported hearing the drum from different parts of the field, their descriptions of the beat and timing matching almost exactly. No recording has ever captured the sound, though several have tried. Microphones set up overnight in areas known for the reports have caught only the ambient noise of the forest. Skeptics point to this as proof that the drumming exists only in the mind, a trick of expectation heightened by the solemn setting. Believers counter that some phenomena simply resist being captured, experienced only in the moment. Standing today on the rolling ground near the sunken road, where the fighting was fierce, the silence feels almost oppressive. The wind moves gently through the trees, and the distant cry of a bird echoes across the field. It is easy to imagine that in another moment, the stillness could be broken by a faint, steady rhythm, one that has been heard for more than 160 years yet never explained. Was the phantom drummer of Shiloh simply a young soldier whose courage outlived his body, his presence marked forever by the beat of his drum? Is the sound an auditory illusion born from a landscape heavy with memory? Or is it something else entirely, a reminder, from beyond the veil, that some parts of the past refuse to be silenced? Until someone can answer these questions, the mystery will remain, carried on the morning mist and the whispered stories of those who still claim to hear the drum. In the dim glow of oil lamps, the White House in 1864 cast long, shifting shadows across its corridors. The scent of burning whale oil mixed with the faint aroma of cigar smoke from nearby offices. Late at night, when the building had grown quiet, some staff swore they saw him, President Abraham Lincoln, striding purposefully toward his study. But more than one observer would later insist that, on certain nights, they saw him twice. The two Lincoln sightings are among the strangest stories to emerge from the Civil War era. While Lincoln himself was no stranger to tales of omens and visions, he once spoke of seeing his own reflection doubled in a mirror. The reports that began circulating in Washington suggested something beyond the private musings of the president. These accounts described Lincoln being seen in two places at nearly the same time, often in entirely different moods or attire. One of the earliest such stories came from a member of his household staff who claimed to have passed Lincoln in the upstairs hallway, hat in hand, only to enter a reception room moments later and find him already engaged in conversation with guests. The timing, the witness insisted, made it impossible for him to have moved from one place to the other so quickly. Other accounts were more unsettling. Mary Todd Lincoln reportedly told a close friend about a peculiar incident when, resting in the Lincoln bedroom, she glanced toward a large mirror and saw her husband's image twice, one standing behind the other. The second Lincoln appeared pale, almost translucent, and she later took the vision as a sign of his coming death. Though this story is often folded into folklore, Mary's interest in spiritualism lends it a strange credibility in the minds of some historians. The simplest explanations for such sightings are rooted in the ordinary. Dim lighting, fatigue, and the stresses of wartime life could play tricks on the eyes. Multiple staff members and visitors might have mistaken another tall, bearded man for the president, an easy error in an era when beards and frock coats were common. The two Lincolns, could have been no more than a matter of mistaken identity compounded by the excitement of being in the White House. Yet, not all of the accounts fit neatly into this framework. Some came from political figures and journalists known for their sharp observational skills. In at least 2 cases, witnesses swore under oath in later memoirs that they saw Lincoln in a public space, a cabinet meeting or a formal reception, only to encounter him in private quarters almost simultaneously. Could these be examples of misremembered timing, the human tendency to compress events in memory? Or did they hint at something more unusual? Speculative theories have inevitably taken root. Some see the sightings as evidence of what was then called bilocation, the supposed ability of a person to appear in 2 places at once. While such ideas sit firmly outside mainstream historical interpretation, believers point to similar stories in other eras, often surrounding figures under intense stress or with an almost mythic public role. Others have wondered if the second Lincoln might have been a deliberate double. The war years saw the use of decoys for military leaders and dignitaries to reduce the risk of assassination. If such a practice were employed for the president, even occasionally, it could explain some of the sightings without resorting to the supernatural. Yet no official record of a Lincoln double has ever surfaced, and those closest to him never admitted to such a scheme. There is also the possibility that these reports are not independent events, but rather the product of a shared narrative shaped by the era's fascination with omens, destiny, and the supernatural. Lincoln's public image was already half-shrouded in myth during his lifetime, and the Civil War's pervasive sense of national crisis may have amplified perceptions of the extraordinary. Even now, walking through the restored rooms of the White House, one can imagine how the flicker of gaslight, the murmur of voices behind closed doors, and the restless energy of a nation at war could feed such a legend. The notion of 2 Lincolns resonates in part because it reflects the dual burden he carried: public leader and private man, visible symbol and solitary thinker. Was it all a matter of poor lighting and human error? An unrecorded use of a political decoy? Or something stranger, an outward sign of a man stretched to his limits, existing in 2 worlds at once? Until more concrete evidence emerges, the mystery of the 2 Lincolns will remain an enigmatic footnote to history, a reminder that even the most documented lives can harbor shadows no record can fully explain. The streets of Richmond in early April 1865 were a chaos of firelight and shadows. Smoke rolled between the buildings as warehouses burned, and the clatter of wagon wheels echoed against brick walls. The Confederate capital was collapsing, its leaders scattering in the final hours before Union troops arrived. Somewhere amid this desperate flight, a member of Jefferson Davis's cabinet, one of the highest officials of the Confederate government, vanished into the night. The exact identity of the man changes depending on the account. Some name the Confederate Secretary of War, others the Secretary of the Treasury, and still others a lesser-known but influential advisor. What is consistent is that this official was believed to be in Richmond during the city's final evacuation, yet his trail after leaving the capital is strangely unclear. Official records suggest that the cabinet members left the city with Davis on April 2nd, traveling south toward Danville. But by the time the government regrouped there, one man was missing from the roll. No death was recorded, no formal resignation tendered. He had simply disappeared. The simplest explanation is that he became separated from the group in the confusion and was captured by Union forces, his detention unremarkable enough to pass without much notice. Yet this theory falters in light of Union records from the period, which contain no mention of his arrest. Nor do they list him among the Confederate officials paroled in the months that followed. Another possibility is that he fled alone, perhaps fearing that his personal role in the government made him too great a prize for Union authorities. In this scenario, he may have traveled under an assumed name, using sympathetic civilians or a network of ex-Confederate operatives to make his way south to Florida, or even to a port where he could leave the country entirely. It is here that the mystery begins to blur into speculation. One thread of the story places him aboard a blockade-running schooner that slipped out of the Georgia coast under cover of darkness, bound for the Bahamas. Another claims he reached Havana, where Confederate agents were still active, and from there disappeared into Spanish territory. More conspiratorial versions suggest that the escape was no mere flight for survival, but part of a prearranged plan. Could this cabinet member have been entrusted with carrying Confederate funds, documents, or diplomatic correspondence that Davis wanted kept out of Union hands? If so, his successful escape would have meant those items vanished with him, beyond the reach of Reconstruction authorities. Some amateur historians have pointed to odd gaps in the Confederate Treasury accounts, amounts recorded as withdrawn in late March 1865 with no surviving record of their delivery. Others note that certain foreign contacts, especially in Britain and France, maintained ties to Southern figures well into the post-war years, despite the Confederacy's collapse. Was this cabinet member acting as a courier for such connections? Then there is the curious matter of the post-war rumors. In the late 19th century, newspaper columns occasionally published brief, almost offhand claims of a former high Confederate officer living under a new name in South America. Locations varied: Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, but the timing of these rumors often coincided with renewed interest in Civil War memoirs and Confederate nostalgia. Were these stories attempts to sell newspapers, or did they reflect whispers from expatriate communities? The truth is elusive. No confirmed grave has been found. No personal papers surfaced that can be definitively linked to him after the war. If he did reach a foreign shore, he may have cut all ties to his past, blending into the life of a merchant, planter, or anonymous gentleman far from the battlefields that once defined him. Standing on the cobblestone remnants of old Richmond today, it is easy to imagine the scene. A single figure slipping through the alleys, coat collar pulled high, avoiding both the glow of the fires and the clamor of the main streets. Somewhere beyond the city limits, a waiting horse, a covered wagon, or even a small boat would carry him toward an uncertain horizon. Was this escape a simple act of self-preservation by a man who saw no future in surrender? Or was it a calculated mission, undertaken with secrets and resources that the Confederate leadership hoped would survive the fall of their government? Until a diary is found in an attic trunk, a letter in a foreign archive, or a descendant comes forward with a long-kept family story, the fate of this vanished cabinet member will remain locked in history's shadows, an unanswered question from the Confederacy's final hours. Beneath the hot Georgia sun, the earth at Andersonville prison was dry and cracked, its pale clay the color of old bone. The prison, officially known as Camp Sumter, sprawled as a rough rectangle of log stockade walls, enclosing tens of thousands of Union prisoners of war. Inside, the ground was churned into mud in places, dust in others, and the stench of overcrowding hung heavy in the air. Yet somewhere beneath this grim surface, hidden from the guards' eyes, lay a secret network of tunnels, escape routes dug by desperate hands that to this day remain shrouded in mystery. Andersonville was notorious for its brutal conditions. Designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, it often contained more than 3 times that number. Food was scarce, disease rampant, and the guards, Confederate soldiers under strict orders, watched the perimeter constantly. The deadline, a line marked by wooden posts several feet inside the stockade, was a lethal boundary. Any prisoner who crossed it risked being shot on sight. In this environment, escape seemed almost impossible. Yet men still tried, driven by the faint hope of freedom beyond the walls. Tunneling became one of the most daring methods. Prisoners would begin digging from within their tents or makeshift shelters, using spoons, canteens, or bits of wood to loosen the soil. The dirt, carried away in pockets or hidden under blankets, had to be scattered carefully to avoid detection. Some of these tunnels are recorded in Confederate reports, their entrances discovered after prisoners made a mistake or were betrayed. Others, however, remain unverified, mentioned only in post-war memoirs, letters, or whispered accounts between survivors. One veteran described a tunnel said to run more than 90 feet, ending just beyond the guard line, its roof reinforced with scavenged sticks. Another spoke of a series of shallow shafts that linked together, like the veins of some subterranean map, allowing prisoners to pass messages and supplies underground. The biggest mystery is not that tunnels were dug, but how many actually succeeded. Official Confederate records list only a handful of escapes via tunneling from Andersonville, but Union prisoner accounts suggest there may have been far more. Some survivors claimed that men vanished in the night, never to be seen again. Whether they reached Union lines, died in the swamps and pine forests beyond, or were recaptured remains unknown. The simplest explanation is that most tunnelers failed to make it far enough. The soil at Andersonville was difficult to work, alternating between hard clay and patches that collapsed easily. The lack of tools made precision digging nearly impossible. Even when tunnels reached outside the stockade, the escapees still had to navigate hostile territory deep in the Confederacy, with little food and no maps. Many likely perished or were brought back in chains within days. Yet some details defy easy dismissal. In the 20th century, limited archaeological work around the Andersonville site uncovered depressions and soil disturbances consistent with collapsed tunnels, some in places not documented in Confederate records. If these were prisoner-built escape routes, why were they never recorded? Were they simply overlooked, or did they belong to escapes that succeeded and were quietly erased from the official story? Speculative theories push the mystery further. A few researchers have suggested that sympathetic guards or local civilians might have secretly aided certain prisoners, providing tools, information, or safe passage once they emerged from the tunnels. While this would have been a dangerous act of treason in Confederate Georgia, it is not entirely impossible, especially considering that war weariness and divided loyalties did exist in the region. Others believe that some tunnels were deliberately hidden after the war. Andersonville became a symbol of Confederate cruelty in the Northern press, and any suggestion that prisoners had successfully outwitted their captors might have been seen as diminishing that narrative. This theory remains controversial and is not supported by direct evidence, but it reflects how the prison's legacy became entwined with politics and memory. Standing on the site today, the landscape is quiet, the grass well kept, and the stockade walls partially reconstructed for visitors. Yet beneath the surface, the ground may still hold the remains of undiscovered tunnels, collapsed shafts, buried tools, and the traces of desperate human effort. Archaeologists tread carefully here, both out of respect and because the soil may yet guard its secrets. Were these tunnels acts of sheer determination that ended in tragedy, or did some lead to freedom and lives lived out far from the war's reach? Did more men escape than official history admits? Their stories lost because they chose not to be found? Until the Earth yields more of its evidence, the escape tunnels of Andersonville will remain an enigma. Narrow, airless corridors of hope and danger, their full story still hidden in the clay. On a quiet rise in eastern Virginia, the fields of Malvern Hill roll gently toward the James River. The grass sways in the breeze, and the only sounds are the calls of distant birds and the rustle of leaves. It is difficult to imagine that in July 1862, this serene landscape roared with the thunder of Union artillery, guns that shattered repeated Confederate charges during one of the 7 days' battles. Yet for more than a century, visitors and locals alike have spoken of hearing something here that defies explanation: the deep, resonant boom of a cannon that no longer exists. The historical record leaves no doubt about what happened on that summer day. Union forces, positioned atop the hill, placed their artillery to devastating effect. As Confederate infantry advanced across open ground, they were met with precise, punishing fire. The volume of gunfire was so great that survivors recalled the earth shaking beneath them, the sound rolling for miles. By nightfall, the field was littered with the dead and wounded, and the Union Army had secured a costly but decisive defensive victory. Today, the actual guns are long gone. The earthworks have softened with time, the trenches now shallow impressions in the soil. Yet, there are persistent stories, some dating back to the late 19th century, of people hearing the report of a single cannon blast echo across the hill, often on calm days when no reenactments or ceremonial firings were taking place. The simplest explanation is that these phantom sounds are natural. The terrain here, with its ridges and open expanses, can carry noises from miles away. Hunters' rifles, quarry blasts, or even construction detonations could, under certain conditions, produce echoes that resemble the boom of artillery. But witnesses familiar with the area often insist that what they heard was distinct, lower in tone, with the long, rolling resonance of a Civil War-era field piece. Some accounts come from park staff and military historians who have spent years on the site. One ranger described standing near the old Union gun line on an overcast afternoon when a single, powerful boom seemed to erupt from the air itself. He saw no smoke, no movement, only the ripple of startled birds taking flight. Others have reported hearing the sound while walking the trails, sometimes followed by what they describe as a faint metallic clatter, as though a cannonball had struck far away. Then there are the more unsettling claims. A few visitors have reported that the blast seemed unnaturally close, so close that they expected to see a gun crew standing before them, only for the field to remain empty and still. On rare occasions, these reports have been accompanied by the smell of burnt powder lingering for several seconds before fading into the breeze. Speculation, inevitably, moves toward the supernatural. Some believe the phantom cannon is an echo of the past, a kind of auditory imprint left by the ferocity of the battle. This idea, while outside conventional science, is rooted in the notion that certain events leave traces in the environment, replaying under specific conditions like a natural recording. Others lean toward a more symbolic interpretation, that the cannon's boom is a reminder, not of any single shot, but of the moment when Malvern Hill became forever tied to the memory of sacrifice and violence. A few theorists push the mystery further still. They point out that in the chaos of the battle, not all shots were accounted for. Could the phantom be the echo of a single misfired or lost round repeating itself across time? While this notion appeals to the imagination, it rests on no physical evidence. It is also worth noting that the reports have not been consistent in location or frequency. Some claim the sound carries from the west side of the hill near the tree line. Others hear it closer to the open slopes facing the Confederate approach. The timing varies as well. Some hear it in the early morning, others late in the day, and more than a few insist it happens most often in the still, heavy air before a summer storm. Skeptics maintain that the phenomenon can be fully explained by environmental acoustics, memory, and suggestion. They argue that visitors arriving at a battlefield are primed to connect any loud noise to the history of the place. If one comes expecting the past to speak, even a distant shotgun blast can take on a more haunting quality. Yet this reasoning fails to account for the small number of witnesses who report the sound while alone, unaware of the stories beforehand, and with no visible or audible source in sight. These are the testimonies that keep the legend alive, passed quietly among locals and battlefield staff, resurfacing every few years when a new account matches an old one almost exactly. Standing today at the crest of Malvern Hill, the wind sweeping across the open fields, it is easy to understand how the imagination might wander. The view is much the same as it was in 1862, the slope rolling gently down toward the tree lines where Confederate troops once formed, the horizon open and wide. One could wait here for hours and hear nothing but the wind. Or perhaps, in a moment when the air grows strangely still, a single deep report might roll across the hill, as if the war had never quite released its hold on this ground. Is the phantom cannon merely the echo of modern noise shaped by the lay of the land? A trick of expectation amplified by the weight of history? Or is it something more? A lingering remnant of a day when the air was thick with smoke, and the sound of artillery shook the earth beneath thousands of marching feet? Until the source is found, or the sound ceases altogether, the mystery of Malvern Hill will remain, as much a part of the battlefield story as the guns that once thundered there. On autumn nights in Franklin, Tennessee, the fields are quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of cedar and turned earth. The Harpeth River flows silently nearby, its dark surface reflecting only the pale shimmer of the moon. Yet some visitors to the old battlefield claim to have seen other lights, small flickering lanterns that drift across the open ground as if carried by unseen hands, moving with purpose before fading into the darkness. The Battle of Franklin, fought on November 30th, 1864, was one of the most ferocious and costly engagements of the Civil War. In barely 5 hours of fighting, more than 8,500 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The field became a place of chaos and devastation, its frozen ground littered with the fallen. That night, as the guns fell silent, surviving soldiers and local civilians lit lanterns to tend to the wounded and recover the dead. For hours, their dim lights moved among the bodies, bobbing in the cold air. This image, the lantern bearers picking their way through the carnage, has become part of Franklin's enduring memory. Yet the reports that began decades later are stranger still. Beginning in the late 19th century, travelers, night watchmen, and residents along the old battlefield roads described seeing solitary lantern lights at night, long after there was any reason for them to be there. The descriptions are strikingly consistent: a pale yellow or white glow, about the size of an old hand lantern, moving low to the ground. Sometimes the lights drift slowly, as if searching. Other times they move with sudden, decisive turns, as though following a path only they can see. No figures are ever visible, and the light fades abruptly when approached, leaving no sound and no trace. The most straightforward explanation is that these are natural phenomena, perhaps the work of foxfire, the bioluminescent glow of certain fungi, or the ignition of swamp gases in low-lying areas near the river. Atmospheric conditions, especially on cool, damp nights, can also refract distant artificial lights, making them appear closer and smaller than they are. Yet those who have studied the sightings note that many occur under conditions that make such explanations unlikely, on dry, windless nights, in areas far from water or marsh, and without nearby roads where a passing vehicle could account for the glow. Some witnesses have claimed the lights seemed to respond to their presence, slowing or changing direction when approached. Others describe hearing faint metallic clinks, like the sound of a lantern's handle shifting, just before the light vanished. One account from the 1930s tells of 2 men who followed a moving light across the field for several minutes, only to have it disappear as they drew near, leaving them standing in darkness in the middle of the open ground. Historians sometimes wonder if the sightings are more than just coincidence. The Battle of Franklin ended with 5 Confederate generals dead and thousands of soldiers lying where they fell. The next morning, burial details worked in haste, marking graves with whatever could be found. Could the lantern lights be linked, in some strange way, to those grim recovery efforts? An echo of the night when the field was lit by hundreds of flames? More speculative theories go further. Some believe the lights could be the result of residual energy, a kind of environmental recording triggered under certain conditions. Others suggest they are tied to specific locations where soldiers died in large numbers or where field hospitals once stood, moving as if reenacting the search for the wounded. Then there are the local legends. A few old Franklin families tell of a Confederate officer whose body was never recovered after the battle, and of a light that roams the field each year on the anniversary, searching for something, or someone, lost in the fighting. While impossible to verify, the story has folded itself into the wider folklore of the battlefield. Even in the present day, the reports persist. Park rangers and historical interpreters occasionally receive quiet, almost hesitant accounts from visitors who have seen a lone light drifting across the grass, often without knowing the history of the lantern stories. Modern ghost hunters have tried to capture the lights on camera, with mixed results, some producing unexplained glows in photographs, others leaving with nothing but the memory of watching the field under a silent sky. Standing on the battlefield at night, the mind cannot help but wander. The ground feels heavy with history, the air charged with a stillness that is not quite empty. If a faint light were to appear in the distance, moving slowly, unhurriedly, would it be just a trick of the eye, or something far older, replaying a moment that refuses to fade? Are the Franklin battlefield lanterns a product of natural forces misunderstood, of memory made manifest, or of something that lies beyond our current explanations? Until their source is proven, or the lights stop appearing altogether, the mystery will continue to drift across the dark fields, much like the lanterns themselves. In the quiet streets of Fredericksburg, Virginia, the brick buildings still seem to hold the echoes of December 1862. The sun sets over the Rappahannock River, casting a warm glow on church steeples that once served as makeshift hospitals. Inside those walls, the air would have been thick with the scent of blood, damp wool, and the sharp tang of antiseptic. Amid this grim scene, soldiers, Union and Confederate alike, spoke of a woman they could never quite name, a nurse who appeared without warning, tended to the wounded with extraordinary skill, and then vanished before anyone could thank her. The Battle of Fredericksburg was a brutal clash. Union forces, attempting to storm Confederate positions entrenched on Marais Heights, suffered staggering losses. The aftermath left the town overflowing with the wounded, filling every available structure. Civilian volunteers joined Army surgeons, moving from cot to cot under the dim light of lanterns. It is in these desperate days that the first accounts of the unknown nurse emerge. She was described as wearing a plain, dark dress and a white apron, with her hair pulled back neatly. Witnesses recalled her calm presence in the midst of chaos, her voice soft but firm as she directed others. She carried no visible medical kit, yet she seemed to have endless supplies: bandages, clean water, even rare medicines. Some swore she spoke with a northern accent. Others were certain she was from the South. Her work was not limited to one side. Surviving letters from soldiers on both fronts describe her tending to enemy wounded without hesitation. One Union private, in a letter home, wrote of a lady unknown to all of us, who moved between the rows like an angel, giving comfort and closing the eyes of the dead. A Confederate sergeant later recalled her steady hands binding his shattered leg, adding that when he awoke the next morning, she was gone, and none of the other nurses knew her name. The simplest explanation is that she was a local civilian whose identity was lost in the confusion. Many women in Fredericksburg risked their safety to help the wounded, moving in and out of improvised hospitals. The chaos of wartime record-keeping could easily have erased the name of one among dozens. Yet some details make this explanation less certain. Multiple accounts agree on the same unusual description: her clothing unsoiled despite the filthy conditions, her sudden appearances in rooms where no one had seen her enter, and her habit of working alone, vanishing before dawn. A Union surgeon, writing years later, remarked that he could never explain how she had reached certain patients in the hours immediately after the battle, when streets were blocked by rubble and sniper fire made movement dangerous. Folklore has taken the story further, suggesting that the unknown nurse was not a mortal woman at all. Some liken her to battlefield apparitions reported elsewhere, figures who appear only in moments of great suffering, aiding the living before fading into thin air. While such claims belong to the realm of legend, they persist, perhaps because the nurse's story contains no clear beginning or end. Another theory ties her to the organized efforts of female relief workers like Clara Barton or the Sisters of Charity. Could she have been a trained nurse traveling incognito to avoid military restrictions on women in combat zones? If so, she may have used a false name, or none at all, to move freely between Union and Confederate lines. In that case, her anonymity might have been deliberate, a means of continuing her work without political entanglements. There are also whispers of a more personal motive. A handful of speculative accounts suggest she may have been searching for someone, a husband, a brother, a son, among the wounded, staying long enough to help others while quietly looking for a familiar face. If she found what she sought, or if she did not, it could explain her sudden and permanent disappearance. Today, Fredericksburg embraces its Civil War history, and the story of the unknown nurse lingers in its historical societies and among battlefield guides. Some visitors claim that in certain church buildings once used as hospitals, they have felt a cool draft or heard the faint rustle of skirts, even when alone. In the dim light of restored interiors, it is not hard to imagine a figure moving silently between the cots, her face half lit by a flickering lantern. Was she simply one of many unrecorded women who answered the call of compassion, her name lost in the fog of war? A trained nurse operating under secrecy? Or something more mysterious, a presence drawn to that place and time for reasons beyond our understanding? Until a diary emerges, a forgotten letter is found, or some long-buried roster of civilian volunteers is uncovered, the unknown nurse of Fredericksburg will remain just that, unknown, her story suspended between history and legend. Morning mist clings to the gentle curve of Antietam Creek, where the old Burnside Bridge still arches gracefully over the water. Its pale stonework, weathered by more than a century and a half, bears silent witness to one of the bloodiest days in American history. On September 17, 1862, this tranquil span became a deadly bottleneck, a choke point where Union troops tried again and again to cross, only to be driven back by a small but determined force of Confederate riflemen positioned on the high bluffs beyond. Among those defenders, history speaks of one marksman in particular, a sniper whose accuracy and persistence became the stuff of battlefield legend. Accounts tell of a single shooter who, for hours, picked off advancing Union soldiers with unnerving precision, often from distances that seemed impossible with the rifles of the era. Eyewitnesses claimed that his shots were so well-timed, so deliberate, that he seemed to anticipate where a man would step before he took the fatal bullet. The official records of the battle mention Confederate sharpshooters defending the bridge, but none identify a lone figure responsible for the most deadly fire. Yet soldiers on both sides described him as a ghostly constant, always firing from the same general area, never seen clearly, and never, it seems, missing his mark. Some Union veterans swore they could remember the sound of his rifle, a sharp crack that carried differently than the others, distinct even amid the chaos. The most accepted explanation is that the Burnside Bridge sniper was simply one of several skilled Confederate marksmen, perhaps a hunter from the surrounding countryside, accustomed to making accurate shots from high ground. Rural Maryland and Virginia were home to men who had grown up with a rifle in their hands, and the hilly terrain gave defenders a strong natural advantage. From this perspective, the sniper's story becomes less a mystery than a testament to deadly skill in the right conditions. But not all the details fit neatly. Union officers reported that the sniper continued firing long after nearby Confederate positions had been overrun or forced to withdraw. In one particularly strange account, a soldier claimed to have spotted a figure slipping away into the tree line during a lull, only for the shots to resume from the same high bluff minutes later, as if the man had never moved. Some have speculated that there may have been more than one shooter working in shifts to create the illusion of a single tireless marksman. Others propose that the sniper may have been aided by a hidden position, perhaps a natural depression in the ground or even a camouflaged rifle pit that allowed him to remain concealed throughout the battle. Still, no such position was ever documented in detail after the fighting ended, and the Confederate withdrawal left little opportunity to investigate. More speculative theories push the story into the realm of the uncanny. A few post-war tales, collected from veterans decades later, describe the sniper as an almost spectral figure, pale-faced and dressed in faded gray, appearing momentarily through the smoke before vanishing without a sound. In these versions, no one could ever approach close enough to see his features clearly, and his body was never found among the Confederate dead. Was this merely the haze of memory? War stories exaggerated with time? Or could it reflect some stranger truth about that day? Adding to the mystery, there are local legends tying the sniper to the land itself. One story holds that he was a former miller whose property was seized by Union forces earlier in the war, leading him to swear vengeance on any soldier who crossed his bridge. Another paints him as a wandering Confederate scout who became separated from his unit, choosing to fight alone until the last cartridge was spent. These stories, while colorful, lack hard evidence, but they persist, passed down in the oral histories of the region. Today, visitors to the Burnside Bridge often remark on the eerie stillness that settles over the site in early morning or at dusk. Some report hearing what sounds like a single gunshot echoing faintly from the bluffs, though no one is there. Others claim to have felt the sensation of being watched from above while walking the path along the creek. Battlefield preservationists dismiss such accounts as the natural play of wind, wildlife, and imagination. Yet for those who know the story, it is hard not to glance toward the ridgeline and wonder. Was the Burnside Bridge sniper merely an extraordinarily skilled rifleman whose name slipped through the cracks of history? A combination of several men's actions condensed into one enduring battlefield legend? Or could there have been something, or someone, more elusive at work that day? The high ground still stands silent, its grasses swaying where rifle barrels once glinted in the sun. The bridge remains, solid as ever, a timeless arc between two banks. And in the mind's eye, one can almost see a figure prone in the shadows above, steadying his aim, patient, unseen, waiting for the next man to step into view. The question lingers: who was he, and is the full story forever beyond our reach? In a quiet corner of what was once a sprawling Confederate medical complex, the air feels thick with the weight of memory. The building is long gone, its walls dismantled, its roof collapsed into dust, but the ground itself still bears faint impressions where tents once stood, and pathways were worn by the endless shuffle of boots. Here, thousands of soldiers passed through in the final years of the war, broken, fevered, and clinging to life. And somewhere within these grounds, history insists, there once existed a meticulous set of records, the official hospital ledgers of the Confederate Medical Service. These were not ordinary documents. Compiled with painstaking care, they listed the names of the wounded, the treatments attempted, the medicines administered, and the surgeons responsible. They recorded which injuries proved survivable and which turned fatal, tracing the ebb and flow of disease, amputation, and recovery. More than just a ledger, they were a map of human endurance and tragedy. Then, without warning, they vanished. The last confirmed mention of the Confederate hospital records appears in 1865, as Union forces advanced deep into the South. Witnesses claim that the ledgers, bound in heavy leather, their pages filled with neat slanted script, were packed into crates alongside other medical stores. From there, the trail grows faint. Some accounts suggest they were loaded onto a wagon bound for Richmond, meant to be preserved with other government archives. Others place them on a train heading south, away from the fighting, in the desperate final days before the Confederate collapse. Mainstream historians have often attributed their loss to the chaos of the war's closing months. Supply lines broke down. Records were abandoned, destroyed, or hastily hidden to prevent them from falling into Union hands. Fires, whether accidental or deliberate, consumed countless Confederate archives in the last weeks of the Confederacy. In this telling, the hospital records were simply one more casualty of destruction, lost forever in the smoke of a dying cause. Yet certain details complicate this explanation. For one, there were claims in the 1870s that fragments of the records had surfaced in private collections, odd, incomplete sections listing only a handful of patients or a single regiment's casualties. How could parts of the ledger survive if the whole had been destroyed? Some researchers have wondered if the records were deliberately concealed rather than lost. What if they contained information the Confederate leadership, or individual surgeons, wanted hidden? The ledgers might have revealed mistakes in treatment, falsified survival rates, or the use of experimental procedures on unwilling patients. They may even have included sensitive notes about soldiers whose injuries exposed secret missions or espionage activity. Theories drift further into speculation when local legends enter the picture. In one small town that once hosted a Confederate hospital, a story persists of a buried trunk, sealed in tar and hidden beneath the floorboards of an abandoned house. The house was demolished in the early 20th century, and whatever was hidden there, if anything, was never recovered. Could this have been one of the missing crates? Others point to the possibility of Union confiscation. During the post-war years, Northern medical institutions sought Confederate records for study, hoping to understand wartime injuries and treatments. Some documents were indeed seized, cataloged, and later misplaced in vast government archives. If the hospital records reached such a collection, they may still lie misfiled in some forgotten corner, indistinguishable from other 19th century paperwork. And then there are the more unusual claims, letters from the late 1800s, suggesting that portions of the records were sold to private buyers, possibly to families seeking information about lost relatives. In an age before organized archives, it is not impossible that such valuable personal histories were broken apart and scattered, each page a separate clue lost to time. Today, the absence of these records leaves a gap in Civil War history that is more than academic. Without them, entire medical narratives are missing. We cannot fully trace the journey of certain regiments through the hospitals, nor accurately measure the toll of disease compared to battlefield wounds. We cannot follow the arc of medical innovation or malpractice within the Confederate ranks. Standing on the grassy field where one of these hospitals once operated, it is easy to imagine the scene. Surgeons bending over crude wooden tables, the air heavy with the scent of ether and blood, orderlies rushing between tents with buckets of water, the low groans of the injured blending with the clatter of instruments. Somewhere in the midst of this, a clerk dipped his pen in ink and set down the details in a ledger that, if found, could speak for thousands of men who never told their own story. Were those ledgers burned in a moment of panic, their ashes scattered to the wind? Are they buried in some unmarked cache, sealed away by those who feared what they contained? Or could they still exist, gathering dust in an attic, waiting for the day someone opens a forgotten crate and finds the Confederacy's silent roll call of the wounded? The land here is quiet now, but the questions linger. The missing records are not just paper and ink, they are lives, locked away in the shadows of the past, and perhaps, somewhere, they are still waiting to be read. In the dim light of a military depot deep in the Union heartland, the iron frames of Gatling guns once gleamed under the flicker of oil lamps. These were the cutting edge of mid-19th century warfare, rapid-firing, crank-operated weapons capable of unleashing a storm of bullets with unprecedented speed. Introduced in the later years of the Civil War, the Gatling gun was seen by some as the harbinger of a new era in combat, a machine that could change the balance of power on the battlefield. But among the Union stock of these fearsome weapons, there is a story of absence, of guns ordered, built, and delivered, but never officially accounted for again. According to surviving military requisitions, a shipment of Gatling guns, numbers vary between 6 and 12 depending on the source, was dispatched from the manufacturer in 1864, bound for a Union supply station in the east. The purpose of their deployment remains unclear. Some historians believe they were intended for field trials. Others suggest they were to be stationed at strategic defensive points to deter Confederate cavalry raids. The first mystery lies in the shipping records. The weapons were documented as having left the factory, packed in heavy wooden crates and accompanied by ammunition. But when inventory lists from the receiving depot were compiled weeks later, the shipment was conspicuously absent. The most straightforward explanation points to administrative chaos. By 1864, Union logistics networks were stretched to their limits, moving massive quantities of supplies across thousands of miles of warfront. Misrouted trains, delayed river transports, and misplaced cargo were not uncommon. Could the Gatling guns have simply been sent to the wrong location, languishing in some overlooked storehouse until the war's end? If so, no record of such a discovery has ever surfaced. Other theories suggest the guns never reached their official destination because they were intercepted en route. The possibility of theft by Confederate agents, opportunistic thieves, or even corrupt Union officers cannot be entirely dismissed. Military hardware was a valuable commodity, and the black market for arms was thriving in both the North and the South. A single Gatling gun could fetch a considerable sum if sold privately, whether to guerrilla fighters, foreign interests, or post-war militias. There are also tantalizing but unverified accounts that one or more of these missing weapons appeared in unexpected places after the war. In 1871, a frontier newspaper in the Dakota Territory claimed that a settler had seen a strange crank gun in the possession of a Native American war party. An assertion met with skepticism by scholars but never conclusively disproven. Another rumor placed a Gatling gun in the hands of Cuban rebels in the 10 Years' War against Spanish rule, though no surviving weapon from that conflict matches the missing models. Could Union officers themselves have diverted the shipment for experimental or covert use? The latter years of the Civil War saw an increase in unconventional military projects, small-scale tests of balloon reconnaissance, ironclad prototypes, and rapid-fire arms. It's conceivable that the missing Gatlings were quietly assigned to a classified program, their existence deliberately obscured to prevent political controversy or enemy awareness. If so, whatever tests they may have undergone left no paper trail accessible to modern historians. Then there is the fringe speculation that the weapons were smuggled to foreign shores before the war even ended. The global arms trade of the 19th century was rife with unofficial deals, and certain Union agents were known to maintain discreet ties with revolutionary movements abroad. A shipment diverted through a neutral port could have ended up almost anywhere: South America, Europe, even the Far East. If this was the case, the Union's loss might have been intentional. The lack of physical evidence makes the trail all the more frustrating. Not a single authenticated missing Gatling gun from the shipment has been recovered. Existing specimens in museums and private collections have all been traced to other, well-documented orders. Without a serial number or maker's mark linked to the vanished guns, identification would be almost impossible even if one surfaced. And yet, the story refuses to fade. Military archivists, amateur historians, and arms collectors still pore over shipping manifests and wartime correspondence, hoping to find a stray reference that might crack the case. Every so often, a lead emerges, a diary mentioning the crank guns, a warehouse inventory with suspicious omissions, but none have yielded the decisive proof needed to explain their fate. Standing in a modern-day armory or museum display, one can see the Gatling gun for what it was in its time, a marvel of engineering, a precursor to the mechanized warfare of the 20th century. Imagine then a dozen of these machines disappearing into the fog of war, their cranks silent, their barrels idle, or perhaps not idle at all, but firing in some forgotten skirmish far from the official record. Were they victims of simple bureaucratic mishandling, lost to the shuffle of war? Were they stolen and sold, their barrels turned against unknown enemies on distant soil? Or are they still out there, hidden away in some barn, cellar, or rusted ruin, the last survivors of a mystery that began over 150 years ago? Somewhere, perhaps, a crate still lies unopened, its contents untouched since the day they left the factory. A time capsule of the Civil War's most advanced weaponry. Until it is found, the missing Gatling guns remain an enigma, locked in the shadows between history and speculation. In the quiet, climate-controlled darkness of a military archive, rows of archival boxes and linen-wrapped bundles hold the remnants of regimental history. Tattered uniforms, rusted bayonets, and faded silk flags that once rippled over battle lines. Yet among these preserved relics, one banner remains conspicuously absent. The battle flag of the 20th Maine, the regiment whose stand on Little Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg became one of the most celebrated moments in Union history. The flag, described in period accounts as deep blue with the state coat of arms stitched in gold and silver thread, had been carried through fire and smoke, its fabric riddled with bullet holes and stained by the rain and dust of long campaigns. It was more than a symbol. It was a witness to the regiment's defining moment, when Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's men repelled repeated Confederate assaults and, in a desperate maneuver, charged down the hillside with fixed bayonets. For years after the war, the flag was reportedly kept with great reverence, displayed during regimental reunions and parades. Photographs from the late 19th century show veterans of the 20th Maine posing proudly with it, the faded silk still bearing the scars of combat. Then, sometime in the early 1900s, the flag disappears from the record. The most straightforward explanation is that it was misplaced during a transfer of historical materials. Many regimental relics were eventually turned over to state governments or historical societies, and cataloging practices at the time were inconsistent. Could the 20th Maine's flag have simply been stored in the wrong box, its identity forgotten as generations passed? Yet archivists have combed through Maine's collections, as well as private holdings, without finding it. Even fragmentary pieces, common for Civil War flags that were often cut into keepsakes by veterans, have failed to match its description. Some historians speculate that the flag may have been intentionally removed from public custody. In the years following the war, the 20th Maine achieved near-mythic status, and its relics became highly sought after. It is not impossible that a veteran, or the family of one, quietly claimed the flag as a personal memento. Such acts, while technically unauthorized, were not unheard of at the time. If the flag did enter private hands, it might still exist, folded in a trunk in an attic, far from the eyes of historians. There is also the possibility of theft. By the turn of the century, Civil War memorabilia had become valuable commodities in the collector's market. Unscrupulous dealers sometimes bribed or deceived caretakers to gain access to storage rooms, removing items with the promise of temporary display that never returned. If the 20th Maine's flag was taken in such a way, it may have changed hands many times over the decades, its provenance obscured to protect its possessors. More unusual theories suggest that the flag could have been deliberately destroyed. Some veterans saw their battle flags as sacred objects that should not decay into ragged ruin. There are recorded cases of flags being burned or buried in ceremonial fashion rather than left to deteriorate in storage. Could an aging veteran of the regiment have decided that no one else should hold the banner, that its final resting place should be known only to those who served under it? The question is complicated by contradictory accounts in regimental histories. One memoir claims that the flag was still in possession of the unit's survivors as late as 1912, displayed at a reunion. Another source, published just a few years later, refers to it in the past tense, as though it were already gone. Neither explains what happened in the intervening time. In the decades since, researchers have traced every surviving artifact connected to the regiment, from Chamberlain's sword to individual soldiers' diaries. Yet, the flag remains conspicuously absent. Museums across the country have been contacted, private collections discreetly investigated, and auction records combed, but no confirmed sighting has surfaced. Occasionally, rumors flare up. A Maine antique dealer claims to have seen a Gettysburg flag in a client's possession. An elderly collector in the Midwest boasts of owning the real Little Round Top banner. In each case, when examined closely, the artifact turns out to be from a different unit or an unrelated era. Still, the idea that the flag could be out there, hidden away, its blue silk now brittle with age, continues to capture the imagination. Such a find would be more than a collector's dream. It would be a tangible link to one of the Civil War's most pivotal moments, a physical reminder of the courage and desperation that turned the tide on a July afternoon in 1863. But if it exists, where might it be? In a dusty attic in Maine, tucked inside an old cedar chest, locked in a bank vault, known only to the descendants of a veteran who took it home? Or does it lie buried in the earth, its colors long faded in some forgotten spot chosen for secrecy rather than celebration? The absence of the 20th Maine's battle flag is more than a simple gap in the historical record. It is a silence, one that leaves open space for both scholarly inquiry and quiet wonder. Some artifacts survive because they were carefully preserved. Others endure because they were hidden, whether for safekeeping or out of a desire to keep their story unfinished. And so the question lingers, more than a century after it was last seen. Does the flag still exist, waiting to be discovered? Or has it already passed beyond reach, its final chapter written in secrecy, known only to those who chose to keep it from the world? Beneath the rolling fields and sunken roads of Petersburg, Virginia, the ground conceals more than just the scars of siege warfare. Here, amid grassy embankments and weathered earthworks, there are whispered stories of a forgotten passageway, a Civil War tunnel, not the famous one dug by Union forces for the Battle of the Crater, but another, more elusive construction whose location has never been definitively confirmed. The siege of Petersburg lasted more than 9 grueling months between 1864 and 1865, turning the area into a labyrinth of trenches, redoubts, and fortifications. The known Union Tunnel, painstakingly excavated by the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry beneath Confederate lines, ended in one of the most infamous explosions of the war. But this other tunnel, spoken of in fragments by veterans and hinted at in obscure wartime reports, was said to have been part of a more covert operation, its purpose cloaked in secrecy. The earliest references appear in post-war memoirs, where soldiers recall hearing of a Confederate countermine beneath the city itself. Some accounts describe it as an unfinished defensive measure, intended to allow troops to move unseen between strong points or to plant explosives under potential breach points. Others claim it was a smuggling route, built not by the military but by civilians seeking to move food, medicine, and even messages between the besieged city and the Confederate lines beyond. The very idea is plausible. Petersburg's strategic location made it a crucial supply hub for Richmond, and its defenders were desperate to maintain lines of communication. Digging a hidden tunnel, especially one shielded from artillery fire overhead, would have been a dangerous but potentially vital effort. Yet no firm evidence survives in official Confederate engineering records, which raises the question, was this tunnel deliberately left undocumented? Over the decades, researchers have sought physical proof. Old maps have been scrutinized for inconsistencies. Surveyors have traced depressions in the earth that could indicate collapsed sections. In the early 20th century, a group of amateur historians claimed to have located a bricked-up entrance in a cellar near the city's historic center. According to their story, the opening descended steeply into darkness, but loose masonry and unstable soil made it too dangerous to explore. The site was reportedly sealed soon after, and, as the tale goes, quietly forgotten. More tantalizing are the reports from construction crews working in Petersburg during the 1950s and 1960s. Several workers recalled encountering sections of underground brickwork that did not match the known sewer or drainage systems. These structures, they claimed, were narrow, with arched ceilings and packed clay floors. In some cases, the passages seemed to curve deliberately rather than follow the straight, functional lines of utility tunnels. Yet when questioned, city officials dismissed these finds as remnants of older infrastructure, unrelated to the Civil War. If a hidden wartime tunnel truly exists, its location is still shrouded in uncertainty. Some theories place it beneath Blandford Cemetery, whose vast expanse provided natural cover for clandestine digging. Others suggest it lies under the historic district's older homes, where basements could have served as discreet access points. A few even believe it may extend beyond the city's wartime limits, linking with rural farmsteads that supported Confederate operations. The absence of conclusive evidence has fueled more speculative interpretations. Could the tunnel have been deliberately destroyed at the war's end to prevent its use by Union occupation forces? Might it have collapsed entirely, leaving nothing but voids deep underground? Or, more provocatively, could it still be intact, hidden behind sealed walls or buried entrances, its contents untouched for more than 150 years? Imagining such a place inevitably stirs questions. If the tunnel remains undiscovered, what might lie within its darkness? Abandoned tools and lanterns left mid-task? Stashes of munitions or food intended for a siege that ended before they could be used? Or perhaps bundles of documents, personal letters, or coded messages that would shed new light on Petersburg's desperate final months? In the absence of definitive answers, the tunnel has become part of Petersburg's layered folklore, a hidden artery running beneath a city that endured one of the Civil War's longest and most brutal engagements. For some, it is a romantic image of resourcefulness under fire. For others, it is a ghost story rooted in the silent, unseen spaces beneath their feet. And yet, the question lingers. Somewhere under Petersburg, does a relic of secret wartime engineering still lie sealed in darkness, its story waiting for the day when a shift in the earth or a curious hand finally breaks through? In the rolling countryside of Kentucky, where mist clings to the low fields at dawn and ancient oaks cast long shadows over forgotten lanes, there are whispers of a burial unlike any other, a secret interment tied to one of the Confederacy's most daring and notorious cavalry leaders, John Hunt Morgan. His name, etched into Civil War history, is synonymous with speed, audacity, and raids that seemed to materialize out of nowhere before vanishing into the hills. But the mystery here does not lie in his life. It lies in the fate of some of the men who rode with him, the fabled Morgan's Raiders, and the alleged clandestine resting place they were given. Morgan's raiders were the scourge of Union supply lines, conducting deep strikes into enemy territory with a precision that baffled even seasoned commanders. Their exploits stretched across Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, sowing chaos far beyond the expected reach of Confederate forces. These were men who lived on the edge of discipline and law, sometimes celebrated as heroes, sometimes condemned as outlaws. By the war's final years, many had been captured or killed, their unit shattered. Yet some accounts suggest that a select group, loyal to the end, met a fate that was never recorded in any official ledger. The story begins with an obscure post-war diary found decades later in the attic of a farmhouse near Cynthiana. In it, a local farmer recounted an unsettling night in the summer of 1865 when he claimed to have seen a wagon convoy arrive under cover of darkness. The wagons, he wrote, were heavily guarded and covered with tarps. The men who escorted them bore no insignia, but their manner was grave and purposeful. They stopped at an isolated bend of the Licking River, unloaded their cargo, and worked through the night, digging in silence. By morning, the place looked undisturbed, save for a patch of freshly turned earth beneath a grove of sycamores. What exactly was buried there? The farmer's account is frustratingly vague. Some believe it was the bodies of Morgan's most trusted raiders, executed or killed in a final skirmish and laid to rest far from prying eyes. Others insist the burial was not of men at all, but of something far more dangerous: gold, weapons, or important documents meant to keep Confederate secrets from falling into Union hands. There is a strange symmetry to these theories. During the chaotic final months of the war, Confederate leaders were known to hide or destroy sensitive material rather than surrender it. Morgan himself had been killed in September 1864, but his legend lived on among those who fought under him. Could his surviving men have carried out one last mission in his name, sealing away either their dead or their most precious resources in the Kentucky soil? A handful of local historians have pursued the trail. In the early 20th century, a series of low mounds were identified in the same general area as the diary's described location. Initial digs revealed nothing conclusive, just disturbed soil and traces of old campfires. Then, in the 1930s, a fisherman claimed his line had snagged on iron rings beneath the riverbank, as if part of a buried chest or crate. By the time anyone returned to investigate, flooding had altered the shoreline, erasing any trace of his discovery. More recent speculation has drawn on Confederate burial customs. In cases where soldiers were interred hastily or secretly, it was common to leave no markers, both to prevent desecration and to keep the enemy from discovering the site. If Morgan's raiders were buried in such a way, the absence of headstones would be intentional, making the site indistinguishable from the surrounding land. This, combined with over a century of natural erosion and farming, would make locating it today nearly impossible. Of course, there are those who dismiss the story altogether, viewing it as an embellished local legend. They argue that without physical evidence, bones, uniforms, or artifacts, it remains nothing more than hearsay layered with romantic notions of Confederate gallantry. And yet, the persistence of the tale, told and retold across generations, suggests that something happened on that riverbank, something the participants were determined to conceal. The deeper question is why. If it was simply the burial of fallen comrades, why not record their names and resting place in church or military records? If it was the concealment of valuables, why did no one return to claim them after the war's end? Were those involved silenced by fate or by choice? Standing on the banks of the Licking River today, it is easy to see how such a secret could be kept. The land rolls gently toward the water, the grass thick in summer, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Sycamores still stand here, their pale bark peeling in the sun, as if holding some quiet vigil. Beneath their roots, the ground is dark and rich, perfect for hiding what one does not wish the world to find. And so the mystery endures. Somewhere in the heart of Kentucky, do the bones of Morgan's most loyal men lie in unmarked graves, their story sealed in silence? Or is it something else entirely, something that, if unearthed, might change our understanding of those turbulent final months of the Civil War? Along the windswept coastline of North Carolina, where the Atlantic crashes in long, rolling waves against a shore lined with sea oats and shifting dunes, the ruins of Fort Fisher stand as a weathered sentinel to the final days of the Civil War. Its battered earthworks, now softened by grass and time, once guarded one of the Confederacy's most vital lifelines, the port of Wilmington. But among the many stories tied to this place, there is one that remains stubbornly unresolved: the mystery of the vanished field guns that were said to have defended its walls. Fort Fisher was an engineering marvel of its time, constructed not from brick and stone, but from massive earthen mounds designed to absorb the shock of Union bombardments. It bristled with heavy artillery, Columbiads, Brooke rifles, and, according to wartime inventories, a series of mobile field guns meant to respond to attacks along the more vulnerable land approaches. These smaller pieces, maneuverable and quick to position, were a crucial part of the fort's defensive strategy. And yet, after the Union's final assault in January 1865, records of several of these guns seemed to vanish into silence. The Union victory at Fort Fisher was decisive. When the smoke cleared and the stars and stripes flew over the battered stronghold, Federal forces began cataloging their prizes. Reports detailed dozens of fixed artillery pieces, but contemporary Union documents make only passing, vague reference to the fort's field guns. No precise count, no confirmed captures. Confederate records, fragmentary though they are, list more pieces in service than the Union reported finding. It is as though, in the chaotic hours between defeat and surrender, these weapons simply disappeared. Some historians propose a straightforward explanation, that the guns were destroyed during the battle itself, their wooden carriages shattered by shell fire, their barrels spiked or buried in the collapsing earthworks. But surviving photographs and engineering drawings of the fort show surprisingly little evidence of such destruction. If the guns had been obliterated, where are the remains? Twisted iron, fractured trunnions, or even fragments? The absence of debris is as puzzling as the absence of the guns themselves. Other theories suggest deliberate concealment. Confederate forces, aware that the fort's fall was inevitable, may have spirited the field guns away during the night, hauling them inland along sandy tracks into the Carolina countryside. Smaller artillery could be dismounted, placed on wagons, and hidden in farm outbuildings or buried beneath layers of earth. But if this happened, no one has ever come forward to claim such a daring salvage operation, and no recovered pieces have been definitively linked to Fort Fisher. Then there is the possibility, more speculative, that some of the fort's defenders chose not to relinquish their most valuable weapons to the Union at all, instead concealing them for use in an imagined Confederate resurgence. After all, even in early 1865, there were those who believed the South might fight on through guerrilla resistance if its armies collapsed. Hidden caches of arms have been found in other corners of the former Confederacy, though none so far have yielded these specific missing guns. What makes the mystery even more intriguing is the absence of reliable eyewitness testimony. The fall of Fort Fisher was a brutal, close-quarters fight, its defenders overwhelmed by the combined might of Union infantry and naval bombardment. In such chaos, precise accounting was nearly impossible. Surviving Confederate officers left few detailed accounts, and Union reports focused more on the fort's grand siege guns than on its smaller mobile artillery. Could the disappearance simply be a bureaucratic oversight? A clerical gap widened by the fog of war? Or is that too easy an answer for a question that has persisted for over 150 years? The geography of the area lends itself to the concealment theory. The Cape Fear region is a labyrinth of tidal creeks, marsh islands, and narrow waterways threading inland. A determined group could have moved the guns by boat under cover of night, navigating through reed-lined channels into remote inlets where recovery would be nearly impossible for an enemy unfamiliar with the terrain. Even today, much of this land remains sparsely inhabited, the marshes swallowing any trace of what they hide. There have been occasional rumors, usually passed down through local families, of heavy iron barrels found in fishing nets or shapes glimpsed beneath the mud at low tide. One persistent tale tells of a farmer uncovering a corroded cannon in the 1920s while plowing a field miles from the coast, only to have it carted away by scrap dealers during the shortages of World War II. Yet, without physical proof, these remain tantalizing fragments rather than confirmed solutions. And so, the vanished field guns of Fort Fisher remain an enigma, suspended between the certainties of military record and the murk of oral tradition. Were they lost to the sea, claimed by the marshes, or hidden with the intent of resurrection in a cause that never came? Standing on the ramparts today, where seabirds wheel over the dunes and the scent of salt hangs heavy in the air, it is easy to imagine the rattle of artillery wheels over sand, the groan of ropes, and the determined silence of men who knew their time was short. Somewhere beyond these shores, in the marsh or deep in the inland woods, could those weapons still rest, untouched since the war's end? Or have they long since rusted away, their mystery preserved only in the absence they left behind? On the banks of the James River in Virginia, where the water flows slow and brown under the weight of history, lies the quiet site of City Point. Today, it is serene. Grassy slopes, scattered trees, and the occasional creak of a moored boat against the dock. But in the summer of 1864, this was no place of stillness. It was the bustling nerve center of the Union Army's operations against Petersburg, a sprawling depot of warehouses, supply trains, troop encampments, and the ceaseless clatter of war. Here, General Ulysses S. Grant established his headquarters, and here, on a sweltering August morning, an inexplicable blast ripped through the heart of the Union's logistical machine. The explosion was sudden, deafening, and devastating. At around 11:45 a.m. on August 9th, a barge loaded with munitions and supplies erupted in a towering column of smoke, fire, and flying debris. Eyewitnesses reported a shockwave that flattened buildings, sent wagons tumbling, and tossed men into the air as if they were rag dolls. Shards of timber and twisted metal rained down across the depot. When the smoke cleared, the scene was one of ruin. Dozens dead, many more injured, and a section of the vital supply line reduced to wreckage. The immediate cause seemed obvious. Something had detonated the barge's cargo of ammunition. But the deeper question, how, has never been answered to complete satisfaction. Theories began almost at once, whispered among the stunned soldiers and sailors picking through the wreckage. The official Union investigation leaned toward sabotage. City Point was a high-value target, and Confederate agents had a history of employing unconventional means to strike behind enemy lines. Among the suspects was a Confederate Secret Service operative named John Maxwell, who, according to some accounts, claimed after the war to have smuggled an infernal machine into the barge's cargo. This device, a crude time bomb concealed in a wooden box, may have been placed aboard without detection, set to ignite hours later. Yet, even with this confession, doubts remain. No such device was recovered, and no direct physical evidence tied Maxwell to the act beyond his own statements, given years after the war's end. Could his story have been an attempt to inflate his own reputation, a boast made to secure notoriety among former Confederates? Or was it a genuine admission of one of the most audacious acts of sabotage in the conflict? Some historians have pointed to the possibility of an accident. With vast amounts of gunpowder, shells, and other explosives constantly moving through the depot, the margin for error was razor thin. A single dropped shell, a careless spark, or a smoldering ember from a nearby fire could have set off the chain reaction. In the frenzied atmosphere of City Point, where thousands labored under the constant stress of supplying a massive army, an accidental ignition was far from impossible. But if it was an accident, why did the official reports tread so lightly on the theory, preferring the notion of enemy sabotage? Was it a matter of morale, a desire to frame the disaster as the work of an enemy rather than a fatal Union error? Then there are the more fringe suggestions, whispered in the decades after the war. Some claim the blast was not the work of Confederate agents or mere mishap, but of shadowy figures seeking to disrupt the Union's advance for motives entirely separate from the war's larger cause. Perhaps profiteers fearing the war's end would disrupt their lucrative supply contracts, or foreign agents looking to extend the conflict. Such ideas are speculative at best, but their persistence speaks to the depth of the mystery and the human need to find meaning in unexplained catastrophe. The geography of City Point only deepens the intrigue. The depot sat on a narrow spit of land where the Appomattox and James Rivers meet, surrounded by water on three sides. To smuggle a bomb into such a closely guarded hub would require either intimate knowledge of Union security or the cooperation, witting or unwitting, of someone inside. How porous were the lines between Union forces, local civilians, and the occupied Southern population during the siege? Could Confederate sympathizers have been working within the Union depot itself? The aftermath of the blast was as telling as the explosion itself. Within days, the Union depot was back in operation, repaired with remarkable speed. Grant himself seemed determined not to let the disaster derail the Petersburg campaign. But in the rush to restore order and function, questions may have been left unanswered, evidence overlooked, and witnesses left unheard. Over time, the memory of the City Point explosion faded from the national consciousness, overshadowed by the larger battles that followed. Yet for those who study the war's lesser-known episodes, it remains an enigma. A moment when, in the heart of the Union war effort, destruction came suddenly, left no clear perpetrator, and vanished into the fog of history. Standing on the riverbank today, with the sun glinting off the slow-moving water, it is hard to reconcile this quiet with the chaos of that day. Somewhere beneath the currents, beneath layers of silt and time, might lie fragments of the barge or traces of the device, if such a device ever existed. Were they placed there by the hand of a cunning saboteur, or were they the result of human error amplified by the hazards of war? And if the truth was known, was it buried deliberately to serve purposes we may never fully understand? Along the windswept coast of North Carolina, where dunes shift under the pull of the Atlantic and salt spray lingers in the air, the remnants of Fort Fisher lie partially reclaimed by time. The once mighty Gibraltar of the South was a sprawling earthen fortress, its sandy ramparts bristling with heavy artillery that guarded the Cape Fear River and the Confederate supply line to Wilmington. In January 1865, this fortress fell after two brutal Union assaults, marking a decisive blow to the Confederacy's ability to sustain its war effort. But while the battle is well documented, a peculiar and enduring mystery emerged in its aftermath. The disappearance of several of Fort Fisher's field guns, substantial pieces of artillery that, according to surviving records, should have been there when Union forces took control. These were not small or easily moved weapons. Field guns of the period weighed hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds, mounted on heavy carriages, and requiring teams of men or draft animals to transport. Union inventories taken shortly after the fort's capture note fewer pieces of artillery than Confederate records had listed in the months prior. A handful of guns, enough to be noticed, but not so many as to raise immediate alarm, seemed to have simply vanished. The first explanation offered was straightforward. Perhaps the missing pieces had been moved before the battle, redeployed to other defensive positions up the Cape Fear. Yet no clear evidence of such transfers has been found, and contemporary reports from other nearby forts and batteries make no mention of receiving them. Could these guns have been quietly removed in the days, or even hours, before the final Union attack? And if so, to what end? Some accounts suggest Confederate troops, knowing defeat was inevitable, may have tried to spirit away the guns to prevent their capture, either by hiding them inland or sinking them in the river or ocean. This was not an uncommon practice. Better to destroy or conceal valuable ordnance than allow the enemy to turn it against you. But here lies the problem. No such hidden caches or submerged guns have ever been found, despite later salvage operations and archaeological surveys of the area. Another possibility lies in the chaotic days following the Union victory. Fort Fisher, like many captured sites, became a hive of activity. Troops moving in, prisoners being processed, supplies being cataloged, and wounded being treated. In such confusion, could some of the guns have been quietly taken for personal profit? The black market for captured weapons, especially in the closing months of the war, was active and lucrative. A few well-placed individuals might have found ways to sell or trade the pieces, breaking them down for scrap or smuggling them to private buyers. Yet the sheer size of the artillery makes this theory problematic. Moving them without notice, even amid the confusion, would have been no small feat. There are also those who lean toward more shadowy possibilities, whispers of foreign involvement. Wilmington had been a critical port for blockade runners, some of whom were connected to British firms supplying the Confederacy. Could the guns have been quietly claimed by these agents, spirited away aboard fast vessels under cover of night before Union control was fully established? If so, their fate may have been sealed far from American shores, melted down or mounted on ships that sailed to distant waters. Archaeologists and historians have revisited the question many times over the decades, combing through period maps, military dispatches, and post-war memoirs. Still, the trail runs cold. No confirmed sightings of the missing guns have surfaced in the years since. Divers exploring the waters off Fort Fisher have found shipwrecks, munitions, and debris from both the Civil War and later conflicts, but none of the distinctive gun carriages or barrels that match the missing pieces. The absence of hard evidence leaves room for speculation. Could the guns still lie buried somewhere beneath the dunes, entombed in the shifting sands that have swallowed other relics of the fort? The coastline here has changed dramatically since the 1860s. Storms, erosion, and human activity have reshaped the land. Entire sections of the original fort are now underwater, and areas that once stood above the surf have long since been claimed by the sea. It is possible that the guns, if hidden hastily, now rest deep beneath silt and salt water, awaiting discovery by some future expedition. Or perhaps they were never missing in the way we imagine. Could Confederate records have been wrong? Inventories in wartime were often imprecise, inflated for strategic deception or muddled by clerical error. A handful of miscounted pieces might explain the discrepancy without invoking grand schemes of theft or concealment. Yet if it were only a matter of faulty paperwork, why has the question lingered so stubbornly in the historical record? Why did it become one of the small but nagging puzzles that refuses to fade away? Standing at the site today, it is difficult to picture the fort in its prime, its massive guns commanding the horizon, its soldiers scanning the sea for enemy sails. The air is quiet now, broken only by the wind and the rhythmic crash of the Atlantic. Somewhere out there, perhaps beneath the waves or buried in the shifting sands, the lost guns of Fort Fisher may still exist, waiting to tell their story. Were they carried away under orders, hidden to frustrate the enemy, or spirited off for reasons we can only guess at? And if they were found, would their discovery finally close this chapter of the fort's history, or open new questions about the secrets that passed between victors and vanquished in those final desperate days of the war?